the twisted twin trees. The forbidden garden sat behind 3 layers of gates, each one taller than the last. Each one painted the same imperial red that looked almost black at night, like dried blood rubbed into wood. And even in daylight, the place felt dim, as if sunlight arrived there only after being searched, questioned, and stripped of warmth. The palace around it was loud with ceremony, with clinking jade and measured footsteps and the constant soft thunder of power moving through corridors. Yet the garden itself was quiet in a way that made the skin tighten, a quiet that didn't feel peaceful but supervised, as though the leaves and stones had been ordered to hold their breath. It was a place the tyrant king did not visit for pleasure, but for proof that his will could reach even into soil, even into the private language of roots. Within the garden walls, every path was curved, just slightly to prevent straight escape, and the pond water was so still it mirrored the sky like polished metal. The lotus blossoms too perfect, too symmetrical, as if they had been trained not to disappoint. Statues of beasts lined the walkways, their mouths open in silent roars, and beneath their paws the stone was worn smooth by years of kneeling petitioners begging for mercy that rarely came. The air smelled of wet earth and crushed petals, sweet in the same way perfume is sweet. Designed sweetness, controlled sweetness. But underneath it was a faint iron scent that no flower ever fully covered. The soldiers assigned to guard this place were selected not for bravery but for obedience. Men who could stare at beauty without wanting it. Men whose hearts had learned to stay quiet. And even so, they walked the garden with their hands never far from sword hilts, because there were rumors about this place that didn't come from servants gossiping, but from older guards with eyes too tired to lie, that the garden listened, that it remembered footsteps, that it kept what it witnessed like water keeps reflections long after the face has left. The story began on a night when the moon hung low and thin, pale as a fingernail clipping, and the palace lanterns trembled in the wind like hearts trying not to be noticed, because that was the night the young lovers died. 2 names whispered only in private, because speaking them too loudly was an invitation to punishment. He was a minor court scribe, the kind of man whose value existed in ink and silence, whose hands smelled of paper, whose eyes had learned to look downward, even when fear screamed to look up. She was a lady in waiting, not noble enough to rule her own fate, yet not common enough to disappear without consequence. Her life spent arranging other people's beauty hairpins, ribbons, the folds of sleeves, while her own desires were treated like stains that must be scrubbed away. They had fallen in love in the small, hidden ways. Love survives under cruelty. A glance held a second too long over a scroll, a brushstroke that lingered on the same character, fingertips touching by accident in a corridor crowded with silk, and each stolen moment became a kind of prayer against the king's authority. But nothing in the palace stayed secret forever. Not when spies were paid in silver and fear. Not when servants listened through screens the way rats listen through walls. And eventually the tyrant learned of it. Learned that 2 lives were trying to belong to each other without permission. And he responded the way tyrants always do. Not because they truly desire what they take, but because they cannot bear the existence of a choice they did not control. He ordered the scribe arrested and dragged into the inner court. And the young man's screams did not echo long because the palace stones were old and used to swallowing sound. And he ordered the girl brought to him and offered her mercy in the shape of ownership, a bargain that sounded like kindness, only to those who had never been trapped. Become mine, and the scribe will live. She refused, because love can be foolish that way. Love can be loyal even when loyalty guarantees pain, and in that refusal, the king heard not morality but insult. The punishment was designed not to end their lives, but to display the king's imagination. He had the scribe killed publicly, not quickly but with deliberate humiliation, as if teaching the court that affection is a weakness the state can exploit. And when the girl saw the body being carried away like a sack of ruined cloth, she did not faint or scream. She simply went pale, very still, and began to smile in a way that frightened even the soldiers, because that kind of smile is what happens when grief becomes a weapon. That night she ended her own life with a hairpin, in a room full of silk and incense, her blood soaking into white bedding like ink spilled across clean paper, and her last breath was said to have left her mouth like a whisper. his name, not as a plea but as a promise. The king's advisors urged him to bury them in separate grounds, to prevent unrest, to prevent the court from turning tragedy into legend. But the king did not fear legend, he feared union. The idea that even death could defy his division, so he devised a cruelty that felt, to him, like the perfect seal. He ordered both bodies buried, not merely apart, but at the opposite ends of the palace cemetery, with stone walls and iron stakes driven into the earth as if to pin their spirits down. As if love could be nailed like paper to a board, guards were posted to watch the graves for 10 nights, instructed to report any strange signs, birds, wind, whispers, because the king was the kind of man who wanted to witness the failure of love with his own eyes. The first night passed with only cold air and lantern light. The second night, the soil over each grave bulged subtly as if breathing. By the third night, the guards found tender green shoots pushing through the dirt. Too fast for nature, too eager. And when they reported it, the king laughed softly, amused, because he mistook the miracle for a mockery that would soon collapse. But on the seventh night, when the palace slept and the garden's pond held the moon like a pale coin, 2 trees rose fully from the earth, as if the ground itself had decided to surrender. One at the far east edge of the cemetery, the other at the far west, both thin at first, yet impossibly tall. Their trunks smooth and dark, their leaves glossy as if lacquered, and the guards swore the branches moved, even when there was no wind, swaying as though searching. The trees should have remained apart, because the distance between graves was long enough for a horse to tire. Yet the following morning, when fog lay thick and the gardeners came to sweep fallen petals, they stopped and stared until their brooms slipped from their hands, because the branches of the east tree had stretched unnaturally across the cemetery like long-reaching arms, and the west tree had done the same. And above the walls and iron stakes, the 2 crowns had found each other, twisting together high overhead in a knot of leaves and wood that looked disturbingly like an embrace. The servants whispered that it resembled 2 bodies, clinging too tightly, ribs pressed together, hands locking, unwilling to let distance exist. The king was told at breakfast, and his chopsticks paused in midair, because for the first time in years something had happened in his kingdom without his approval. He ordered the guards to stand closer, to watch for trickery, and in the nights that followed, those guards began to change. Small changes at first. They avoided looking up. They spoke less. They swallowed often as though their throats were dry. One man began to wake from sleep with wet cheeks, insisting he had dreamed of a girl whispering into his ear from inside a tree. Another claimed he heard the scraping of fingernails from beneath bark, but the most consistent report, the one that passed from mouth to mouth like a contagious chill, was about the sound that came when wind moved through the twisted branches. Not the ordinary rustle of leaves, but a thin, trembling sob, a sound like someone crying quietly with their mouth covered, each gust drawing the grief through wood as if the trees themselves were breathing heartbreak. The older guards tried to dismiss it as superstition, but then the birds arrived. Strange birds, ash-gray with pale throats, not common to palace gardens, gathering at dusk and perching on the knotted branches as if waiting for instruction. Their calls were wrong, too deliberate, too human in rhythm, a 3-note cry repeated over and over in the same pattern until the listening mind began to hear words inside it, and some of the guards swore the birds were calling the lovers' names, pulling syllables out of wind like spirits tugging at cloth. On the 9th night, one soldier young, newly assigned, still naive enough to believe in normal rules, walked beneath the trees to prove courage, and the moment he stepped into the shadow of the twisted canopy, he stopped, stiff, as if struck, his lantern flame flickering violently, because from inside the trunk above him came a soft tapping sound, gentle and rhythmic, like someone knocking from the other side of a wall. The boy raised his hand to touch the bark, and when his fingers pressed to the wood, the tapping became a heartbeat beneath his skin. Slow, steady, unmistakably alive. He jerked back with a gasp, and in that gasp the ash-gray birds screamed in unison, their calls turning sharp enough to slice the night, and the boy fled sobbing, swearing that for one breath he had felt hair brush his knuckles from inside the tree like a lover's touch. By the time the king heard of that, His amusement had curdled into anger, because tyrants tolerate fear only when it serves them, and this fear belonged to someone else. He marched into the forbidden garden himself at dawn, surrounded by soldiers in perfect formation, and as he approached the cemetery, the air seemed to tighten around him as if the garden were holding its breath. The pond water still as glass, the statues' stone mouths gaping silently. He looked up at the twisted canopy and saw what everyone else had seen. Branches knotted together like arms locked in embrace. But what he could not tolerate was the way it looked peaceful, the way it suggested that love had found a path around his will. He ordered the trees cut down immediately, his voice calm but edged with satisfaction, as if destruction were the easiest kind of proof. Axes were brought. Guards formed a circle, and when the first blade struck the east trunk, the sound that came out was not the crack of wood, it was a wet, soft cry, intimate as breath against an ear, and the bark split not into dry splinters, but into dark seams that glistened, and along those seams a thin red liquid began to bead slowly, as if the tree were bleeding, in patient disbelief. The first axe blow landed with a sound that made every soldier's spine tighten, not the clean crack of timber, but a dull, wet thud, like striking soaked cloth wrapped around bone. And the blade did not bite deep at first, as it should have. Instead, it stuck for a heartbeat in the trunk, as if the wood had clenched around it. And when the executioner yanked the axe free, the bark peeled back in a long, dark curl that looked disturbingly like skin, revealing beneath it not pale sapwood, but a bruised red fleshiness threaded with darker veins. And along that exposed seam, the red liquid began to gather in tiny beads. So slow and deliberate, it felt almost thoughtful, then rolled down the trunk in narrow trails like tears learning gravity. A low murmur moved through the soldiers' half-disbelief, half-instinctive fear, and their lantern flames flickered in the morning air even though there was no wind, as if the light itself had flinched. But the tyrant king only narrowed his eyes, lips pressing into a line that suggested annoyance more than horror, because to him nature was another servant, and servants were allowed to bleed as long as they obeyed. Again, he ordered calmly, and the axe rose and fell, each strike loosening more bark, widening the wound. And with every widening, the sound from within the trunk grew clearer. A thin, trembling sob pulled through wood like breath pulled through a cracked reed, a voice too soft to fully become language, yet intimate enough that the men closest to it felt it press behind their ribs as if it recognized them. One guard, an older man with scars from border wars, swore later that the sobs were not random, that they followed the rhythm of pleading, as though the tree were trying to speak in a mouth it no longer had. And when he mentioned this, his own eyes filled with tears he could not explain, his face twisting with a grief that did not belong to him. The king noticed the wavering discipline immediately. He always noticed weakness the way wolves notice limps, and he stepped closer to the wounded trunk, ignoring the red beads sliding toward his boots, because fear only angered him when it was not his. He lifted his gloved hand and pressed his palm to the exposed inner wood as if testing ripeness, and the instant his touch made contact, the sobbing stopped so abruptly the silence rang, replaced by a new sound that made the back teeth ache. A faint grinding, like two stones rubbing together in deep darkness, as though something in the tree had begun to clench in hatred. The ash-gray birds perched above reacted at once, their bodies jerking upright, throats expanding, and they let out that three-note cry in perfect unison. Louder now, sharper, a call that cut through the garden like iron through silk. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, repeating, until the listening mind began to hear not a bird call but a name being forced into the air, dragged out of wind and memory. Soldiers shifted uneasily, hands tightening on spear shafts, because the birds' voices carried a human cadence, the cadence of morning chants, and even the gardeners watching from afar pressed their lips together as if afraid the sound might crawl into their mouths and speak for them. The king's face hardened, and in that hardness was something almost childish, an insulted possessiveness, because the trees were not simply defying him by growing, they were performing love in public, turning death into spectacle, and spectacle was supposed to belong to him alone. Cut both, he snapped, voice colder, and axes moved to the west tree as well, blades biting into bark, red liquid beating again, and now the garden filled with layered grief. two trunks weeping, branches above, twisting tighter as though trying to hold each other even harder. And in that tightening, the leaves made a sound like fabric being wrung out. The strangest part was the scent that rose with the bleeding. Not fresh sap, not resin, but something sweet and metallic, like bruised fruit mixed with old coins, like a perfume worn too long by someone dead, and it drifted across the cemetery until the soldiers' stomachs turned, because scent is a truth the mind cannot argue with. When the west trunk split open, a small object fell from the wound and landed in the wet grass with a soft tap. A hairpin tarnished but unmistakably delicate, its metal stained dark red, and the nearest guard stared at it with widening eyes, as if he had seen a finger drop from a sleeve. Another axe blow shook the east trunk, and from that wound dropped a strip of paper, folded and sealed with wax, as if it had been kept safe inside the tree itself. And when the paper hit the ground, it unfurled slightly, revealing the faint strokes of a scribe's handwriting, elegant, careful, intimate, the kind of writing used not for court records, but for love letters hidden beneath pillows. The men froze, because now the trees were not only bleeding, they were returning what the king had tried to bury, offering proof from within their bodies, like testimony from a witness that could not be silenced. And the king's jaw tightened so hard the muscles jumped, his eyes narrowing at the letter as if it were a weapon aimed at him. "Burn it," he hissed, and a guard hurried forward, snatching the paper with trembling hands. But the moment his fingers touched it, he gasped sharply and dropped it again, because the paper was warm like skin held too long in sunlight, and when it fell, the ash-gray birds screamed louder, their calls spiraling into a frantic rhythm that made several soldiers press hands to their ears as if the sound were drilling inside. The king lifted his arm and gestured impatiently, and the guard forced himself to pick the letter up again with the edge of his sleeve, carrying it toward a brazier. Yet the closer he moved to fire, the more the wind in the garden seemed to change direction, bending toward the trees, and with that bending came the sobbing again, louder, and beneath it a second sound, soft, rhythmic like fingernails dragging inside wood, like something trying to claw its way toward the surface. The guard reached the brazier and held the paper above flame, and the instant the edge began to brown, the two trees above shuddered violently, branches twisting tighter until leaves tore free in showers, and from within the knotted canopy came a sudden wet crack, like a joint snapping, followed by a single cry, so sharp and intimate it made the soldiers flinch, as if struck this one. Not a sob, but a scream, choked by bark, and at that scream, the ash-gray birds erupted into flight, circling the garden in a frantic spiral, while repeating their three-note call, over and over as if summoning something beyond the palace walls. The letter caught fire, curling into ash, but as it burned, the strange thing happened. The smoke did not rise straight upward. It drifted sideways, winding toward the wounded trunks, and when it touched the bleeding bark, the red liquid thickened, darkening to the color of old wine, and the grooves in the wood began to resemble writing, thin lines forming characters that looked too deliberate to be random. Two names carved slowly by bleeding sap, appearing and reappearing, as if the trees themselves were insisting on being remembered. A few soldiers fell to their knees without understanding why, their faces wet with tears, their mouths trembling as though grief had entered them like a spirit. And when one man tried to stand, his legs shook so violently he could not, as if the ground beneath the cemetery had become soft, pulling him downward in sympathetic mourning. The king watched this spreading weakness with rising fury, and fury is the only fear tyrants allow themselves. So he shouted for more men, more axes, and when the trunks finally began to lean, wounded enough to surrender, the branches overhead tightened one last time, knotting together with a convulsive twist that looked like arms locking around a beloved body. And as the trees started to fall, the wind surged through the garden in a sudden cold gust that carried the unmistakable sound of two voices whispering at once, not words, not clearly, but a shared breath filled with longing so close it felt like the cemetery itself had spoken into every listening ear. Together, the trees did not crash to the ground the way trees should, with a final loud surrender and silence afterward. They fell like bodies, slow, heavy, unwilling, dragging their intertwined crowns down in a long groaning arc that sounded eerily like a throat trying to swallow grief. And when the trunk struck the wet earth, the impact released a deep, muffled pulse through the cemetery stones as if something underneath had been struck awake, while the red liquid that had been weeping from the bark splashed across the grass in thin fans that looked too bright against the palace's carefully trimmed green. Soldiers stepped back instinctively, boots slipping slightly on the slick soil, because the air changed the moment the trees hit the ground, warmer, thicker, sweet with rot and iron, like a cellar door had been opened and something old had exhaled. Above them, the ash-gray birds continued their frantic circles, but their pattern was no longer random. They flew in tight rings that widened and narrowed like a ritual diagram, and every time they passed over the fallen knot of branches, they screamed their three-note call in perfect synchronized rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, until even men who refused superstition felt their minds begin to shape the sounds into syllables, into names, into the terrible intimacy of lovers calling to one another from opposite sides of death. One young guard pressed his palms to his ears until his knuckles whitened, yet the sound did not lessen, because it wasn't entering through ears alone, it seeped through skin, through breath, through the spaces between thoughts, and as the birds cried, the fallen branches began to twitch, not from wind but from a slow internal tightening, like muscles remembering how to hold. The knot of leaves and wood seemed to writhe in small increments, twisting itself more firmly even on the ground, as if refusing the idea of separation even after falling. And when a soldier moved forward to cut the branches apart, his blade hovering over the tangle, he froze, because from inside the knotted wood came a faint whispering. Two voices layered so closely together they sounded like a single breath being shared, soft, trembling, urgent, as if the branches were not branches but arms locked around each other, and cutting them would be like cutting through a living embrace. The king saw the hesitation, and his expression sharpened into cold contempt, because hesitating before his command was the closest thing to rebellion his soldiers could imagine. So he stepped forward himself, robes immaculate, boots clean, even in wet grass, and he drew his sword long, bright, perfectly maintained, a blade that had ended more lives than most men had ever counted. And he struck downward into the tangled branches with a swift, decisive motion meant to humiliate nature into obedience. The blade sliced through wood and leaf with unnatural ease, and the instant it did, the air filled with a sound so intimate and horrifying that several soldiers gagged. A wet gasp, like lungs drawing breath for the first time after drowning, followed by a thin, broken sob that sounded distinctly human. And from the cut in the branch, a thick bead of red liquid welled up and rolled along the blade's edge, like blood searching for a vein. The king's face tightened, annoyance flickering for the first time into something else, unease. But he masked it instantly with a second strike, then a third, carving the knot apart with methodical fury. And with every cut, the birds shrieked louder, their calls no longer mournful but commanding, as if they were issuing orders to something unseen. The soldiers began to whisper among themselves with pale faces, because now the birds' cries sounded less like names and more like summoning, like the old folk songs about soul-calling birds that perch on execution grounds and cry until the dead remember their bodies, until grief becomes heavy enough to lift itself out of earth, and then the ground responded. A subtle tremor ran through the cemetery soil, so gentle it could have been imagined, yet strong enough to make scattered petals quiver, strong enough to make a thin crack appear in the wet mud near the east grave, and from that crack seeped not water but a darker moisture with the same spoiled sweetness, as if the earth itself had begun to bleed in sympathy. One guard, older and steadier than the rest, fell to his knees and whispered a prayer under his breath, and when asked later why, he said he had felt something brush his shins from below like hair drifting in floodwater. The king ignored the tremors and ordered the remaining wood dragged away and burned, because to him, cleansing by fire was always the final argument, and soldiers obeyed, rope thrown, branches hauled, yet, as they pulled, the intertwined remnants resisted with a strange elastic tension, creaking like joints, and the red liquid smeared along the grass in a long trail like a dragged wound. They brought the wood to a fire pit in the forbidden garden, where charcoal had already been prepared, and when the first branch was tossed onto the coals, the flame did not leap eagerly, as it should. It hesitated, flickering low, as though even fire was reluctant to eat something that still remembered love. Then, as the birds screamed overhead, the flames surged suddenly in a tall, twisting column that burned not orange, but a sickly pale gold. And within that flame, shapes seemed to move, two silhouettes, pressed together, separating, pressed together again, an illusion perhaps, yet vivid enough to make several men stumble back with white faces. The burning wood released thick smoke that did not rise cleanly, but curled and folded on itself like fabric being wrung. And inside that smoke, for a heartbeat, voices became clearer than they had ever been. Not sobbing, not whispering, but a faint chanting. Two lines repeating in counterpoint, one voice calling, the other answering. The rhythm, like a love poem recited across a wall. The king stood rigid, jaw clenched, watching the fire consume proof he could not tolerate. And in that rigidity, his fear finally revealed itself. Not fear of spirits, not fear of death, but fear of meaning. Fear that the court would remember this moment. Fear that love would become legend, and legend would outlive his cruelty. So he gave a final command, meant to drown legend in silence. Kill the birds. Archers were summoned, bows drawn, arrows released in quick, hard volleys that cut through damp air with sharp whistles, and ash-gray bodies dropped from the sky like torn paper, striking stone and grass with small, dull impacts. Yet even as they fell, they kept crying, throats convulsing, beaks opening again and again. 3 notes repeated until breath ran out, until sound became silence. And the most horrifying part was that the cries did not stop when the birds died. The pattern continued in the air itself, softer now, like an echo trapped in the garden walls, like a memory refusing to be executed. Soldiers gathered the bird corpses into baskets, but when they lifted them, they felt strangely heavy, as though weighted with something more than flesh, and one man dropped his basket with a strangled yelp, because the dead birds' throats were warm to the touch, warm like living skin, as if they had swallowed voices that still burned. The king ordered the baskets thrown into the same fire, and as the ash-gray feathers caught flame, the smoke shifted again into the shape of wings. Wings circling, wings pointing downward, and then, without warning, the wind gusted hard through the forbidden garden. Not like ordinary wind, but like breath expelled by something awakened, and it carried the final 3-note call across the palace rooftops, beyond the walls, into the city streets, into the sleeping quarters of servants and officials alike, until men woke in cold sweat, believing they had heard 2 names whispered directly into their ears. That night, despite the king's satisfaction at having cut, burned, and killed, no one in the palace slept well, because the forbidden garden did not return to quiet. There was still the faint rustle of leaves, even though the trees were gone. Still the soft tapping under the cemetery soil as though knuckles pressed from below. Still the lingering scent of spoiled sweetness and iron. And at midnight, when lanterns burned low, a palace maid passing the cemetery swore she saw 2 thin saplings pushing up through the mud, one on each end of the graveyard again, green and tender and impossibly fast, their tips already bending toward each other as if guided by an instinct older than fear, while somewhere above the wall, unseen in the dark, a single surviving ash-gray bird perched silently and opened its beak, not to cry, but to listen, as though waiting for the dead to answer. The tyrant king told himself the garden had been cleansed, that fire had chewed through the last proof of defiance, that ash and smoke could not knit themselves back into meaning. Yet in the days that followed, he began to notice the smallest rebellions. Quiet ones, the kind that do not announce themselves loudly, but press into the mind like cold fingertips. At first it was only the wind. It started arriving in the palace in strange patterns, not the steady seasonal wind that carries dust and leaf, but sudden narrow drafts that slid down corridors like someone exhaling through a crack. Drafts that made lantern flames lean in one direction, then another, as if responding to invisible footsteps. Servants began to complain that doors closed by themselves, not slamming, just shutting softly with finality, as if the palace had learned to mimic the sound of graves being sealed. And whenever those drafts passed through the forbidden garden, the guards posted their new ones now, because the older ones had requested reassignment, with pale faces would stiffen, swallowing hard, because the air made a sound like fabric being rubbed between wet hands, and beneath it, like a hidden harmonic, a faint two-voiced sigh that made the hairs on their arms rise. The king pretended not to hear, because a tyrant's pride depends on selective deafness. But the garden did not allow ignorance for long, and on the 7th night after the burning, the first soldier disappeared. He had been stationed at the cemetery wall, lantern in hand, and when his replacement arrived to relieve him at dawn, only the lantern remained still lit, flame trembling in the pail, morning set neatly on the ground beside a patch of soil that looked freshly disturbed, as if something had been dragged under with careful hands. The king's advisors urged him to ignore it, to blame drunkenness or desertion, yet the king ordered the cemetery dug, because if something could take a soldier from under his authority, it offended him more than murder ever could. Spades bit into wet earth, and at first they found only mud and roots, but then they hit something harder than stone, a thick woven mass beneath the soil, like braided rope, slick and fibrous. And as the men pulled it free, the horror revealed itself. Roots, but not ordinary roots. Roots twisted together in tight coils that looked like arms locked around a body, and embedded between those roots were fragments of cloth. Uniform cloth threaded through as if the earth had been sewing the soldier into the embrace. One man retched, another dropped his spade and fled, and even the captain's voice shook when he reported it. Yet the king's face remained cold, almost thoughtful, because he recognized the pattern of defiance. This was not random haunting. This was union insisting on itself, even underground, even in the dark. He ordered the roots cut out and burned, and again fire did its work reluctantly, flames pale and sickly, smoke curling sideways toward the cemetery as though trying to return. But the next night another soldier vanished, then another, always leaving behind a lit lantern, always leaving disturbed soil and that faint scent of spoiled sweetness mixed with iron. Soon the guards began to whisper that the garden was hungry not for flesh like a beast, but for company, for witnesses, for bodies to pull into its story until the entire cemetery became a single tangled knot. The king, furious at being challenged by something he could not drag into court and execute publicly, decided the garden itself was the enemy, not the trees, not the birds, but the place, the very soil. So he commanded, the forbidden garden destroyed, walls torn down, pond drained, every stone removed, every root dug up, the cemetery uprooted and moved. And for the first time in years the palace trembled with the sound of true labor. Hundreds of men with shovels and carts, sweat and curses, the empire turning its weight against a patch of earth. As workers tore down the outer walls, a wind rose, sudden and cold, and the men paused because the air through the broken stones carried a sound like quiet weeping. But the foreman shouted and the work continued, because fear is easiest to ignore when you are part of a crowd. They drained the pond, and at the bottom, where lotus roots should have been workers, found a tangle of pale fibrous strands braided into shapes that resembled hands, fingertips carved by nature into delicate curves, and one strand had wrapped itself around a fallen hairpin like a lover refusing to let go. They dug, and the more earth they overturned, the more roots they found, thick as wrists, thin as fingers twisting together in spirals that seemed to tighten when exposed to air. And in the soil around those roots the men found small objects that should not have survived burial. A piece of silk ribbon, a fragment of wax seal, a strip of paper with ink blurred but still readable, always the same two names appearing again and again like the earth had memorized them. Workers tried to burn the roots, but the flames sputtered, and when the roots finally blackened, the ash did not crumble properly. It clumped into small twisted shapes, like charcoal arms still trying to hold. The king watched from a raised pavilion, expression hard, but his fingers kept tightening on the railing until the wood creaked, because he was beginning to understand something terrifying. The garden was not merely haunted, it was rewriting law, rewriting physics, teaching the palace that love could turn into structure, into architecture, into a living force that moved matter. On the 3rd day of demolition, when the cemetery soil was nearly emptied, a worker's spade struck something hollow wood deep beneath where the original graves had been, and men unearthed a coffin that was not supposed to exist there, its lid sealed with black wax and bound with iron strips like a prisoner. The king demanded it opened, because tyrants cannot resist opening what has been sealed against them, and when the iron was pried away, the lid lifted with a wet sigh, releasing a rush of cold air that smelled not of decay but of flowers crushed in a closed book, the scent of preserved longing. Inside lay two bodies, not skeletons, not rot. Two bodies, preserved unnaturally, the lovers, faces pale, mouths slightly parted as if mid-whisper, and between them, in their locked hands, lay a knot of fresh green leaves, still wet with sap. The workers backed away in terror, but the king stepped closer, fascinated despite himself, and as he stared at the lovers' faces, their eyelids trembled. It was so subtle. It could have been a trick of light, yet every man present felt it in his gut like a stone dropping. They were waking. The king's breath hitched for the first time, and he barked an order to smash the bodies, to scatter them, to destroy them utterly, because now he could no longer deny that death itself had been defied. But before the command could be carried out, the wind roared through the broken garden walls in a sudden violent gust. Lanterns snuffing out, dust spiraling, and from somewhere deep under the earth came the ash-gray bird's three-note call. Impossible, because the birds had been killed yet clear as a bell, echoing across the open space, as if the garden itself had learned to imitate their throats. The workers froze, some dropping to their knees, some sobbing openly, and in the coffin, the lovers' fingers twitched, tightening around each other, their hands refusing separation, even under the king's gaze. The king staggered back one step, not from fear of ghosts, but from fear of losing fear that his authority had finally met something it could not command. And in that fear, his mind did what tyrants' minds always do when reality refuses to obey. It invented a new cruelty. He ordered the lovers' bodies taken to the palace hall and displayed under guard, because if the garden insisted on union, he would turn their union into captivity, a public prison of flesh. The bodies were carried away, stiff and eerily intact, and the coffin left behind in the torn soil like a mouth gaping. That night, as rain returned and softened the ruined garden into mud, the palace filled with whispering again, not from servants, but from walls, from floorboards, from the damp air itself, and guards near the display hall began to hear it. Two voices layered together, murmuring a love poem in broken fragments, repeating the same line over and over until it became a chant. We find, we find, we find, and each time the wind moved through the corridors, the line fluttered like leaves, and men found themselves turning toward one another without meaning to, drawn by something gentle and inevitable, as though the palace, no matter how many stones were removed, had already been seeded with roots that would keep growing until every act of separation collapsed into an embrace. The bodies of the lovers were displayed in the grand hall as if they were trophies of law, laid side by side on a lacquered platform beneath hanging silk that smelled of incense and old dust. Guards stationed at every pillar with spears upright and faces stern, because the king believed that if he could force their union to exist under his gaze, then he could claim dominion over even this miracle. Yet the hall itself seemed to dislike the arrangement. The lantern flames burned too low. The air tasted faintly sweet and metallic, and the polished floor reflected the lovers, like water reflecting a moon that did not belong. The courtiers were ordered to witness them, to step forward and see how rebellion looks when pinned down. But as each noble approached, their confident expression would falter in strange ways. A hand trembling around a sleeve, a throat swallowing too often, a sudden wetness in the eyes that no etiquette could fully hide, because the lovers' faces were peaceful in a way that made cruelty look childish. Their mouths relaxed as if they were still sharing one breath. The king sat above them on his throne, watching, forcing the hall to be quiet, because he wanted silence to feel like victory. But the silence did not stay silent for long. First came the wind, slipping through the hall in thin drafts that should not have existed, lifting the edge of a curtain, making a single chime tremble softly, and within that tremble, the faintest sound emerged, so delicate it could have been a trick of hearing. A whisper layered with another whisper, like two voices speaking from behind a wall. Guards shifted, tightening grip on spears, and the chief minister glanced up nervously at the rafters as if expecting the beams to answer, but the king's face remained composed, his fingers tapping the armrest in a measured rhythm that matched his impatience. The whispering grew more distinct as night deepened, threading itself into the hall's air like smoke. Soft syllables, broken phrases, a private vow repeated again and again, until it became less like speech and more like wind learning language. And the more the king demanded quiet, the louder the whispering seemed to become, not in volume but in presence, filling the spaces between breaths, slipping into ears when men tried to sleep, pressing itself against the mind until even the bravest soldier began to imagine that love was a thing that could move through stone. On the third night of display, a guard on the left side of the platform heard a tapping beneath his boot. Gentle, rhythmic, like knuckles knocking from below, and when he shifted his weight, the tapping followed, matching him as though the floor were trying to speak through pressure, and when he reported it, the captain slapped him for superstition. Yet later that same night, the captain's own spear began to vibrate faintly in his hands, a soft trembling that rose up the wood like a heartbeat, and when he placed the spear tip against the floor, he felt the tapping clearly, patient as roots. By dawn, fine cracks had appeared along the hall's polished tiles near the platform, thin lines that no mason could explain. And from those cracks rose a faint scent of wet soil, fresh and undeniable, as if the forbidden garden, though demolished, had found a way to breathe inside the palace itself. The king ordered the tiles replaced immediately and the cracks filled with resin. But the repairs did not hold, because by the next night the resin had darkened, bubbling slightly, and along its surface tiny green tips pushed up like needles, soft leaves unfolding with impossible speed. The palace gardeners screamed and tried to pull them out, but the tips resisted, not with strength but with persistence, and each time they were torn away, another emerged beside it, and soon the green was no longer confined to a crack. It spread beneath the platform like a concealed net. The lovers' bodies remained still, yet their fingers, those locked fingers, began to tighten in tiny increments, the knuckles whitening as though the hands were remembering how to cling, and those who watched swore the lovers' chests rose and fell faintly, a shallow breath shared between them, slow as sap. The king, furious, ordered the bodies separated at last, because captivity had not silenced the miracle. It had only moved it indoors, and in his mind separation was always the solution, the tool that had never failed him with armies or dissenters. So soldiers approached with trembling hands and pried at the lovers' fingers with iron hooks. But the hands would not release, the flesh did not tear, the bones did not snap. It simply held, stubborn as root. One soldier, sweating, forced the hook deeper, and the moment the iron touched the lover's skin, the hall filled with a sound so intimate it made men recoil. A wet sigh, two voices exhaling at once, and the lantern flames flared pale gold, casting shadows that looked like branches twisting across the ceiling. The ash-gray bird's call, impossible, dead, burned, echoed suddenly from the rafters. 3 notes repeated in perfect rhythm, and the soldiers froze, eyes wide, because they could not see any birds, only the beams above. Yet the sound carried the same human cadence of a name being spoken lovingly. The king rose from his throne, rage cracking the polished mask, and he shouted for axes, for saws, for knives, because if hands would not release, then hands would be removed. And the cruelty of that command made the entire hall feel colder, as if even stone flinched. Blades were brought, and the executioner stepped forward, lifting his cleaver above the lover's locked wrists. But before he could strike, the floor beneath the platform shuddered stronger this time, unmistakable, and the cracks in the tiles widened like mouths opening, and from those openings green burst forth in a sudden violent surge. Vines thick as wrists, wet with soil, twisting upward with frantic purpose as though the earth itself had lunged into the hall. The guards stumbled back, shouting, spears dropping, because the vines did not crawl randomly, they moved with intent, winding around pillars, climbing walls, latching onto beams, searching, reaching, and wherever they touched stone, the stone darkened with damp, as if roots were drinking directly from palace bones. Within seconds, the platform was encircled by living green, and two thicker vines rose like arms, wrapping gently, yet firmly around the lovers' bodies, lifting them as if cradling, while thinner tendrils coiled around their locked hands like lace, reinforcing the grip. The king screamed orders, but the sound drowned beneath the rush of leaves, the creak of wood under sudden weight, and within that rush came the whispering again, clearer now. Two voices no longer broken, but whole, soft, calm, impossibly patient, speaking a vow that felt older than any throne. We find each other. We find each other. The vines moved the lovers toward the hall's far wall, where a great carved window opened onto the night air. And as they approached, the glass fogged with a breath that did not belong to any living person, the fog swirling into two faint silhouettes pressed together. And then, with a sharp crack like bone breaking, the window shattered outward, shards raining into the courtyard. Moonlight spilled into the hall, pale and cold, and in that light the vines carried the lovers through the broken frame and out into open air, like a single creature bearing its heart back to the world. Soldiers tried to follow, but the vines lashed out not violently, not like whips, simply blocking, forming a wall of green that pressed against them with the steady pressure of inevitability. And in that pressure the men felt a strange sorrow flood their chests, a grief so heavy their limbs weakened, because the vines did not hate them. It merely did not recognize them as obstacles worth harming. The king rushed to the window, face twisted in fury and disbelief, and what he saw below in the courtyard stole breath from even his throat. The vines had rooted instantly into the stone tiles, splitting them with quiet strength, and two trunks were rising again, one thickening at the base, the other rising beside it, twisting around each other as they grew, bark forming in spirals like muscle, leaves unfurling in glossy waves, and within moments, the two lovers were placed at the base of the trunks, as if being returned to their rightful grave. The trunks bent toward each other, their branches knotting together, and as they knotted, the red liquid beaded again along fresh bark like blood. Remembering the shape of sorrow, the ash-gray birds alive again or never dead at all, perched on the new branches in silence, watching. And when the king leaned out the window to shout, his voice caught, because the birds opened their beaks and released, not the three-note call, but something softer, a lullaby-like coo that carried the cadence of forgiveness. And for one heartbeat the king had felt the terrible truth that his power did not matter in the face of something that simply continued. He ordered archers to shoot, but the soldiers' hands trembled, bows lowering as if the sight had stolen their obedience, because in the moonlight the two trees looked like a single embrace carved into the world, an embrace so stubborn it made cruelty seem small. The king's face drained of color as he watched the trunks thicken, the branches rising beyond the courtyard wall, reaching higher, twisting tighter. And he realized with cold nausea that even if he cut them again, even if he burned them again, even if he salted the earth and tore down every stone, the story would grow back somewhere else. Because stories fed by love do not require permission. In the following weeks, the palace began to change around that courtyard. Vines crept into cracks, roots pressed beneath tiles, blossoms appeared where no one planted them, and servants whispered that at night two shadows walked the corridors hand in hand, leaving wet footprints that smelled of soil and flowers. The king grew restless, sleepless, because the whispering followed him now. Not loud enough for others to hear, but constant in his private chambers like breath against his ear. Two voices repeating the same calm sentence. You cannot separate what the earth has joined. He attempted to flee the palace, to move his court to a new fortress, but on the morning of departure, his horse refused to step beyond the gate, rearing and screaming as if it had smelled something beneath the road. And when the king struck it in rage, the animal bucked him into the mud. And from that mud, impossibly, two small shoots rose instantly, twining around the king's boot as if greeting. The king tore them away with shaking hands and stared at the green tips. And for the first time in his life, his authority felt like a paper crown in rain. They say no, not they say, because this wasn't rumor, but recorded in the private diary of a palace physician who later fled on the final night of the tyrant's reign. He woke screaming, clutching his chest, convinced that roots were growing inside him, tightening around his heart. And when servants rushed in with lanterns, they found him sitting upright in bed, eyes wide, mouth working soundlessly as if chewing grief, and on his tongue were 2 green leaves, fresh and wet, as though he had been kissing the earth in his sleep. By morning he was dead, face frozen in an expression of stubborn disbelief. And when they carried his body out through the courtyard, the 2 trees' branches bent low in the wind even though the day was still, and the bark wept, a thin bead of red that fell onto the tyrant's coffin, like a final punctuation mark. Long after the palace was abandoned, long after moss softened the stones and rain washed imperial paint into pale ghosts of color, travelers who wandered near the ruins reported the same thing. 2 giant trees standing where the throne room once was, trunks twisted together so tightly you could no longer tell where one ended and the other began, their leaves whispering constantly, even on windless nights. And if you camped too close and listened, you could hear it beneath the rustle, 2 voices sharing one breath, not angry, not vengeful, simply enduring, reminding anyone who passed that there are embraces. The world cannot cut apart, and there are kings who discover too late that roots do not fear crowns. The empty casket, the air inside the stone tomb was so cold it felt less like temperature and more like intention, as if the mountain itself had decided long ago that nothing warm, no breath, no prayer, no human heartbeat should remain here for long. And every torch the Emperor's men carried seemed embarrassed by how small its light looked against the damp black walls. The passageway descended in tight steps carved into rock, each step worn slightly concave by years of ritual feet. Yet tonight, those footsteps did not belong to monks or caretakers. They belonged to soldiers and officials, men who carried authority like armor, but whose faces betrayed something softer and uglier beneath. Fear dressed as loyalty. Water dripped from the ceiling in slow, deliberate drops that landed on stone with a sound like distant tapping, and the Emperor, wrapped in thick ceremonial robes, walked at the center of the procession as if inside a dream he could not wake from, his breath visible in the torchlight as pale smoke, his eyes fixed ahead with the stubbornness of a man who has outlived his own certainty. Above them, somewhere far beyond the rock, the palace slept in its warm silk corridors, unaware that its ruler had chosen to descend into the throat of the earth because grief had become heavier than crowns. The guards did not speak the dead woman's name down here, not aloud because names echo too clearly in tombs, and echoing names has a way of inviting answers. But everyone knew who this tomb belonged to. The wronged empress, once celebrated as a fragrance in spring, then condemned as a shadow, then executed not with a blade in public, but with silence behind closed curtains, the kind of death that leaves no satisfying ending for witnesses and therefore survives for years as suspicion. She had been accused of treachery, of witchcraft, of carrying misfortune inside her sleeves, and the Emperor, who had once loved her with the obsessive tenderness of youth, had allowed the accusations to harden into verdict, because power teaches men to fear what they cannot control, and love, true love, always carries the scent of uncontrollable. She died alone, and her coffin was sealed with stone, and the palace moved on, as palaces always do, replacing one woman with another, one season with another. Yet the Emperor's dreams did not obey policy, and in his sleep he began to smell her, the exact perfume she used to wear, thick with night-blooming flowers, so vivid it woke him with his heart pounding, his mouth dry, his sheets damp with sweat, as if the scent itself had pressed him down. At first he told himself it was memory, grief fermenting into hallucination. But then the scent began to appear in waking hours, too faint at first, like the ghost of perfume in an empty sleeve, then stronger, blooming suddenly in corridors where she had once walked, in the throne room where she had once knelt, even in the Emperor's private study where no woman had entered for years. Servants noticed it and grew pale. Eunuchs whispered prayers under their breath, and the new Empress, alive, watching, threatened by a dead rival, complained that the palace smelled like rot, disguised as flowers. Meanwhile, rumors crawled through the city like insects, that the wronged Empress had been buried too quickly, that the coffin had never truly held her, that the Emperor had killed not an enemy but his own luck. And so, one winter night, when the moon was thin and the Emperor's chest felt tight with longing that had turned to paranoia, he ordered the unthinkable. The tomb would be opened, the coffin examined, the truth confirmed with his own eyes. It was an act of love, disguised as suspicion. And suspicion is the more acceptable face of love for men in power. The deeper they descended, the stronger the scent became. Not the dry, medicinal incense of funerary rites, but a living fragrance, wet and floral, so rich it seemed to fill the lungs like smoke. Officials coughed into their sleeves, eyes watering. One soldier gagged and leaned against the wall, and when his glove brushed stone, his palm came away damp with something slick that smelled faintly sweet. The Emperor did not cough. He inhaled as if starving, his face tightening with both yearning and dread, because the scent was unmistakably hers, too precise to be coincidence, too intimate to be imagined, and the knowledge of it made the hair rise on his arms beneath the silk. At the end of the passageway, the tomb chamber opened into a wide vault, supported by thick pillars carved with protective charms. Though down here the carvings looked less like protection and more like desperate pleading, the characters cut deep, as if the stone itself had been scarred by fear. The coffin sat in the center on a raised platform, immense and heavy, its lid sealed with resin and iron bands, and on its surface lay offerings left by caretakers over the years, withered flowers, folded paper prayers, and most unsettling of all, a pair of new silk ribbons tied neatly at the foot of the coffin, bright red as if placed yesterday. No one admitted to tying them. The Emperor approached slowly, each step sounding too loud on the stone floor, his footfalls echoing as if the chamber were measuring his approach. The scent grew nearly suffocating now, thick enough to make the torch flames flicker as if struggling to breathe. And when the Emperor reached the coffin, his gloved hand hovered over the iron band for a long, silent moment, trembling very slightly. Not with age, but with the fear of confirmation. Fear that she was truly dead, and fear that she was not. At his signal, the soldiers pried the iron loose with crowbars, metal groaning, resin cracking in small, sharp pops like bones being separated, and each pop seemed to release another wave of fragrance, as though the coffin had been holding perfume the way lungs hold breath. The officials stepped back, eyes stinging, but the Emperor leaned forward, staring with the intensity of a man prepared to be ruined by the truth. The lid was lifted slowly, first a fraction, then more revealing darkness inside that looked too thick, too absolute, like a mouth opened into deeper earth, and for a heartbeat, the entire chamber seemed to inhale. Then the lid came free, and the torches leaned inward, as if compelled, and all sound stopped. Not only voices, but even the drip of water seemed to pause because there was no body inside. No bones, no cloth, no hair, no ring on a finger, only emptiness lined in pale silk, perfectly clean, as if untouched. And in the center of that emptiness, set with ceremonial precision, lay a pair of embroidered shoes, delicate and small, stitched with golden thread in patterns of cranes and clouds, the kind of shoes an empress would wear, only inside her private chambers, never on stone, never in mud. The shoes sat toe to toe, as if waiting for feet to slip into them, and the fragrance pouring from the coffin was so strong it felt alive, thickening the air until men's eyes streamed tears. One official whispered a prayer, and then choked on the scent, collapsing to his knees. Another man laughed once, high and broken, then clamped a hand over his mouth as if afraid the emptiness might hear him. The Emperor stared down at the shoes for a long time, and in that silence, his face changed. Grief and relief twisting together into something monstrous. Because the absence was not a simple answer, it was an accusation. She had not rotted here. She had not turned to ash. She had simply not been contained. The Emperor reached into the coffin with slow, trembling hands and lifted one shoe, and the moment his fingers touched the embroidery, his breath hitched sharply. Because the silk was warm, warm like it had been worn recently, warm like skin memory, and on the inside of the shoe, pressed into the fabric, there was the faint, dark imprint of a footprint, as if a foot had stood there and then stepped out just moments ago. The Emperor's eyes flicked up to the tomb chamber, as if expecting to see her standing behind him, yet the only thing behind him was stone and torchlight, and men too terrified to meet his gaze. He lowered the shoe back into the coffin with trembling care, like returning a sleeping creature to its nest, then stepped backward, throat working as if trying to swallow the scent itself. The officials begged him to seal the coffin again immediately, to leave, to report the emptiness as a sacred mystery and never speak of it. But the Emperor's pride would not accept mystery, and his love, if love was still the right word, would not accept absence. "Bring it," he said quietly, voice hoarse, and his men froze. "Bring the shoes to the palace." No one dared argue. The embroidered shoes were wrapped in silk and placed in a carved box. Yet, even through the lid, the fragrance leaked, blooming into the tunnel as they carried it upward like a living plume. By the time they reached the palace, dawn had not yet arrived, and the corridors were still dim, lanterns burning low. The air dry and warm compared to the tomb's cold, and yet the scent moved through the hallways like a presence returning home. Servants woke coughing, believing a garden had caught fire. Guards at distant gates began to whisper that a woman in pale robes had walked past them without making sound. The Emperor retired to his private chamber with the box placed at the foot of his bed, and for the first time in years, he slept without a dream, not because he was at peace, but because the scent in the room was so thick, it felt like being held. At midnight, he woke abruptly, heart pounding, because the palace was silent in that unnatural way. It becomes silent only when everyone is holding their breath, and in that silence he heard it. A single soft step, the precise sound of silk soles touching polished floor tap, followed by a pause long enough for his mind to beg for explanation, and then another step, tap measured, unhurried, moving toward his bed with the calm confidence of someone who had every right to enter. The Emperor lay rigid beneath his blankets, eyes wide in the dim lantern glow, unable to call for guards because his throat had tightened into a knot, and as the footsteps continued, tap, tap, he realized with a sinking dread that the sound was not coming from the hallway outside. It was coming from inside his own room, from the foot of the bed where the box sat. And with every step, the fragrance intensified as if warmed by motion, until the air became nearly unbreathable with blossoms and something darker beneath, something like iron hidden under sweetness. The steps drew closer, tap, tap, and then stopped beside the bed, close enough that the Emperor could hear the faint whisper of embroidered silk shifting, close enough that he could sense a presence without seeing it, and in that presence he felt the most terrifying thing of all. Not hatred, not vengeance, but emptiness. An absence so deliberate and patient it made his heart feel like a candle flickering in a sealed room, because whatever had returned from that coffin was not a corpse or a ghost you could plead with. It was the proof of what he had tried to bury: love, suspicion, cruelty walking calmly on golden-threaded soles toward the man who had ordered silence, and it had brought the tomb's cold patience with it into the warm heart of the palace. The Emperor did not move for a long time after the footsteps stopped beside his bed, because a ruler can command armies yet still become a child when darkness puts a whisper next to his ear, and in that stillness he felt the full weight of the horror. The room was the same room it had always been. Silk curtains, carved screens, a brazier glowing low, yet something had been added that could not be seen, something that made the air feel occupied, like a chair pulled out by an invisible hand. His eyes strained into the lantern dim, trying to locate a shadow that didn't match furniture, trying to catch the outline of a figure. But there was nothing, only the box at the foot of the bed and the rich floral scent thick enough to taste, as if the palace itself had become a closed, perfumed jar. He swallowed with effort, throat dry, and forced his hand toward the bell rope beside his pillow, meaning to summon guards, to fill the room with living voices that might chase absence away. But before his fingers could touch the cord, he heard the softest sound, shh, like silk brushing silk, and the fragrance shifted, blooming closer to his face, and the Emperor froze again because the movement did not sound like a person walking. It sounded like shoes being taken out of a box, like careful hands he could not see, lifting embroidered soles and placing them on the floor with the reverence of ceremony. A single step followed. Nearer now tap, and with it came an impossible detail, a faint coldness that spread across the bed linens, as if winter air had drifted in through a crack in the wall, and the Emperor realized the footstep wasn't merely sound. It was pressure, it was presence, pushing down on the floorboards hard enough for the room to answer. He forced himself to sit up, his silk robe sliding from his shoulders, and as he did, his gaze fell to the polished wood floor beside the bed, empty, shining softly in lantern light. Yet a thin, wet mark had appeared there, the shape of a small footprint, darkening the wood as if a foot damp from tomb-cold stone had stepped out of nowhere. The Emperor's breath caught, and a whisper of panic rose behind his ribs, because the footprint held fine details, the curve of an arch, the delicate taper of toes as precise as a stamp pressed into lacquer. But there was nothing above it. No leg, no hem of robe, no shadow. Another step sounded tap, and a second wet print appeared, perfectly paired, angled slightly inward as if the wearer was turning toward the Emperor's bed with quiet deliberation. The king's heart hammered so hard he felt it in his teeth, and still he could not look away, because the horror of absence has a strange gravity. Your mind becomes obsessed with the empty space where something should be. He lunged toward the box at the foot of the bed, driven by a desperate logic that if he could lock the shoes away, the footsteps would stop. But as his fingers reached the lid, the box was already open. The lid tipped back. Silk wrapping loosened as though someone had opened it before he even decided to move. And inside, the embroidered shoes were gone. His hands hovered over emptiness, trembling, because again the answer was not a thing, but a lack. No shoes, no body, only fragrance, thick as punishment. He stumbled back, nearly tripping on his own robe, and pressed his palm against the wall to steady himself. But the wall felt colder than it should, damp in patches as if the tomb's breath was seeping through stone. And at that same moment the footsteps began again, slow and measured tap, tap, circling the bed, not rushing, not hunting, simply pacing the way someone paces when they have waited years and will not be hurried now. The Emperor's mind scrambled for strategy the way it always did when confronted with threat. He reached for rational explanations, servants playing tricks, assassins, hiding, poison, incense, but each thought dissolved under the simple fact that footprints were forming without weight of flesh, and the air itself felt attentive. "Who is there?" he rasped finally, voice hoarse, and the words sounded pathetic against the quiet. A command that could not find a target. The footsteps paused, and for a heartbeat the room tightened as though listening. Then a new sound came, faint, delicate, a barely there creak like old leather stretching, followed by a soft clink as if a golden thread had brushed against a jade ornament. The Emperor's gaze snapped toward the sound and found, hanging beside the screen near the window, one of her hair ornaments, an old phoenix pen that had been sealed away years ago, swaying gently as if touched by passing silk. Though no wind moved the curtains, the object's presence in his chamber struck him harder than the footprints, because it suggested memory, intention, selection. Whatever was walking here knew the palace, knew her, knew him. A fresh burst of fragrance rolled through the room, and in that scent his mind betrayed him with a vivid recollection, her standing in the exact place the ornament now swayed, smiling with eyes lowered, adjusting the pin as she prepared for a private audience, her perfume rising around her like a secret garden. The Emperor's chest tightened painfully. "I did not," he began, meaning, "I did not want your death. I did not mean it. I was fooled. I was king. I was weak." But his apology broke into a cough, because the scent was now suffocating, petals and sweetness pressing against his lungs, until breathing felt like swallowing flowers. The footsteps resumed, coming closer to the bed tap, tap, and as they approached, the wet footprints began to change, becoming darker, thicker at the heel as if something heavier than water now stained them, and in the dim light, the marks looked faintly reddish, like diluted blood mixed into tomb moisture. The Emperor backed away until the edge of the bed pressed into the back of his knees, and he reached for the dagger kept under his pillow, not because he believed it could stab emptiness, but because a weapon in hand feels like identity, like proof you are still alive and capable of action. His fingers closed around the dagger handle, and the cold metal steadied him for a fraction of a second until the footsteps stopped directly in front of him and the wet prints formed right beside his bare feet, close enough that the chill from them seemed to crawl up his skin. Then something else happened that unraveled his last thread of control. The prints shifted again, toes angling outward, and the spacing between them widened slightly, as if the invisible wearer was kneeling. The Emperor's breath caught, because kneeling was a court gesture, a ritual of intimacy and accusation, and he suddenly realized the horror was not random haunting but reenactment, the palace replaying moments it had tried to erase. He heard, faintly, the whisper of cloth lowering SHFF, the way silk sleeves settle when a woman kneels, and though he saw nothing, he felt the air in front of him become denser, like an unseen figure occupying a space too close. His dagger hand trembled. "Speak," he demanded, voice cracking, but the only response was the softest exhale, fragrant and cold, like breath passed through flowers left in a coffin. The Emperor's eyes stung, not only from scent but from fear-fueled tears, and in that sting he sensed something approaching his hand, not with touch, but with absence. An emptiness pressing close to his dagger fingers as if examining them. The dagger grew colder suddenly, as though held briefly in a tomb, and the Emperor yelped and almost dropped it. When he looked down, he saw the imprint of a small footprint on the dagger blade itself, damp and dark, as if an invisible soul had stepped onto his weapon, with contemptuous ease, pinning it like a child stepping on a toy. The Emperor's stomach turned. He could not stab what could step on steel. He could not threaten what had no flesh to bleed. He forced himself to stand straighter, to become Emperor again, and he shouted for guards, voice echoing down corridors. Yet the echo sounded wrong, muffled, as if the palace itself had placed a hand over his mouth. No footsteps of guards came, no startled voices, no clatter of armor, only the steady tap, tap of embroidered shoes moving away from the bed, toward the door, unhurried, as if the presence had decided the Emperor was not ready yet. He watched the wet prints travel across the floor and pause at the threshold, and then, impossibly, the prints stopped and turned back as if the wearer had glanced over his shoulder. The scent thickened into a final suffocating wave, and in that wave the Emperor heard something he had not heard in years. Her laugh, not loud, not joyful, but soft and incredulous, the laugh of a woman realizing too late that love can be sentenced by cowardice. The Emperor's knees weakened. "Wait," he whispered, the words spilling out before pride could stop it, because longing is always stronger than authority in a quiet room, and the footprints lingered for one heartbeat just long enough to feel like mercy, then faded as though absorbed into the floor, leaving only dampness and scent behind. The Emperor stood shaking in his own chamber, dagger useless, lungs aching, and when dawn arrived and servants finally entered, they found him standing beside the bed with eyes wide and sleepless, surrounded by faint, wet footprints that led not to any door or window, but in circles around the bed, as if something had been measuring the distance from him all night. He ordered the room scrubbed until the floor shone raw, ordered incense burned until the scent of her perfume was drowned in bitter smoke, ordered the embroidered shoes locked inside 3 boxes of iron and wood, and sealed with wax as though sealing away a law. Yet that night, despite every lock and seal, the palace again fell into that unnatural hush, and from the corridor outside his chamber came the sound steady, patient, inevitable tap, tap, tap approaching like regret that had finally learned how to walk. By the 3rd night, the Emperor stopped pretending he could sleep, because sleep had become the most dangerous room in the palace, the only place where the world went quiet enough for absence to speak clearly. And he sat upright in his inner chamber, with a robe wrapped tight around him, incense thick in the air like bitter fog, eyes fixed on the sealed boxes stacked near the foot of the bed as if staring hard enough could force reality to obey. The shoes were locked away in 3 layers, iron, hardwood, lacquer, each sealed with wax stamped by the imperial crest. And yet the fragrance still found its way out, blooming faintly through cracks like a memory leaking through stone, sweet and suffocating, flour heavy with a dark metallic undertone that made the tongue taste pennies. Outside the chamber, guards stood on both sides of the corridor, men chosen for courage, but courage is fragile when it must face what cannot be struck, and their faces had the stiff blankness of those trying not to become superstitious. The Emperor kept his dagger in hand, even though he knew it was useless, because he needed something to hold, something solid. And when the palace lanterns dimmed toward midnight and the last voices in the servants' quarters faded into uneasy hush, the Emperor felt the air shift subtle at first, like a door opening somewhere far away, and then the sound arrived again, not inside his room this time, but clearly in the corridor beyond the screen. Tap, 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 slow, measured, as if the footsteps were not searching, but following a route already memorized. The guards straightened instantly, spears tightening in their hands. Then the Emperor listened so hard his teeth ached, because the pacing had changed, no longer circling his bed like curiosity, but advancing with purpose. One step, pause, one step, pause. The exact rhythm of court etiquette when someone approaches a sovereign's door for private audience. The steps drew closer, and the guards began to sweat, glancing at each other with the helpless horror of men realizing that discipline cannot block a thing made of nothing. One guard whispered, "Who goes there?" And his voice shook despite his best effort. And in response, the corridor filled with fragrance so suddenly thick it felt like a hand pressed a bouquet against the mouth, and the steps did not stop. Tap, tap, passing between the guards as if they were not there. And the most terrifying detail was what the guards did next. They flinched backward, eyes wide, not because something touched them, but because a cold brush of air slid against their cheeks like silk sleeves drifting past. Intimate and unmistakably human. The left guard later swore he felt hair graze his wrist, soft as cobweb, and he nearly screamed, because in that brush, there was the calm certainty of a woman who had walked this corridor 1,000 times and would not be halted by two trembling men with spears. The footsteps reached the Emperor's door and paused, and though the door remained shut, the Emperor heard the faintest sound at the latch. Not metal scraping, not force, but a delicate click, as if an unseen hand had tested it politely. His mouth went dry. He should have commanded, should have roared, should have called priests, called ministers, called the entire court to witness. But when you are alone in the dark with something you wronged, authority feels like a costume you suddenly can't remember how to wear. The latch clicked again, and the Emperor's heart slammed, because the door did not open outward, it opened inward, and the Emperor realized with a sinking dread that the locks were irrelevant. Locks matter only to bodies. Then the sound changed. Instead of the latch, he heard the whisper of cloth lowering, a faint controlled rustle, as though someone outside the door had knelt into perfect posture and was waiting to be invited. And in that posture was the deepest insult. She was not breaking in like a monster. She was approaching like a rightful resident returning to her place. The Emperor's chest tightened with grief so sharp it felt like punishment. "Enough," he rasped, voice hoarse. "Enough. I will honor you. I will build." He didn't know what he was promising: temples, statues, apologies written in stone, anything that might satisfy emptiness. But the footsteps answered him only by resuming, not entering yet, but moving away again down the corridor, as if she had come only to remind him that the palace belonged to her route, not his wishes. The guards dared follow at a distance, lanterns trembling, and the Emperor, driven by that toxic mixture of fear and longing, followed too, robe trailing, dagger useless in his sleeve, moving through corridors where palace art watched from walls with painted smiles. The footsteps led them not randomly, but with unerring memory, past the jade screen where she used to pause to adjust her sleeve, past the corridor bend where she'd once bowed to the Emperor's mother, past the small side hall where servants used to bring her hot water for washing. Everywhere the steps went, wet prints bloomed on the lacquered floor, dark, tomb cold, sometimes faintly pink, as if the palace was being rebranded by her absence. Each footprint a signature pressed into wood. Servants who woke to the sound peered from door cracks with terrified eyes, and some began to sob because they recognized the route too. Recognition is more frightening than the unknown. While older eunuchs lowered themselves to the floor, foreheads touching tiles, whispering prayers to a spirit they believed had returned not to haunt, but to reclaim. The steps finally stopped at a door the Emperor hadn't opened in years. The old Empress's private chamber, sealed since her death, its threshold dusted with fine white powder to ensure no one entered. The guards watched as fresh wet footprints appeared over the powder, pressing it into damp paste. Crossing the threshold effortlessly, and the door still locked creaked open from within, as if the room itself had decided to breathe again. The Emperor's skin crawled as he stood at the doorway and looked inside, because the room smelled exactly as it had when she was alive. Warm flowers, clean silk, a faint, sweet oil that had once clung to her hair, but also the coldness of tombstone layered beneath, like death sitting politely behind perfume. The chamber was dim, lit by moonlight through lattice windows, and in that pale light he saw that the air was not empty. The curtains stirred, though no wind blew, and the mirror on the dressing table gleamed with a faint fogging breath, as if someone unseen had leaned close enough to make the glass mist. The Emperor stepped in, heart pounding, and the door eased shut behind him without a slam. Soft, intimate, like a private audience being sealed. His mouth went dry as the footsteps moved again, tap, tap crossing the room toward the dressing table, and he watched in horror as the hair ornament the phoenix pin lifted slightly from the table, and then settled back, as if placed by invisible fingers with ceremonial care. Then the dressing box lid opened by itself, slow, deliberate, revealing combs, ribbons, small jars of powder long untouched, and as the lid rose, that suffocating fragrance poured out like a confession, and within it, the Emperor heard the faintest sound of breathing, not his own, not the guards outside, but a second breath that seemed to come from inside the room's emptiness. He wanted to speak her name, to say it like an offering, but his throat seized, because the Emperor suddenly understood that the horror here wasn't about a ghost demanding vengeance. It was about presence returning without permission. The way mold returns to a damp corner no matter how many times you scrub it. The way guilt returns to a man who tries to outlive his crime. The footsteps stopped behind him, close, too close, and a cold pressure settled on his shoulder as if a hand had rested there. Not heavy, not violent, just intimate. And the Emperor shuddered because the gesture was familiar, affectionate, even the exact way she used to touch him when she stood behind him and adjusted his collar. His eyes stung with tears he despised, and he whispered, "I didn't mean it." But the air around his ear warmed with perfumed breath, and though no mouth was visible, he heard a whisper shaped out of absence itself. Soft, calm, devastating. "You watched." The words landed like a verdict stamped into bone, because they were true. He had not plunged the hairpin. He had not tied the silk. But he had allowed it. He had sat on a throne and let cowardice wear his face. The cold hand tightened slightly on his shoulder, and his knees weakened, and in the mirror ahead his reflection wavered, then changed, because for one heartbeat, behind his own face, he saw her standing there, not rotting, not monstrous, simply pale and perfect, eyes lowered, lips faintly curved in that sad knowing smile. And the most horrifying detail of all was that the reflection's feet were missing. Beneath her robe there was only shadow, as if she was nothing but perfume and protocol, only a route the palace remembered too well. The Emperor flinched back, and the reflection vanished, leaving only his trembling face and the room's emptiness, yet the cold presence remained, and the footsteps began again. Tap, tap moving toward the bed inside her chamber, as if preparing to lie down, as if death itself had come to reclaim the place where her dreams used to live. Outside, the guards heard the door lock click from within, and when they tried to force it, their hands slipped as if the wood was coated in cold dew, and one guard began to cry quietly because the scent leaking from the room was so strong it reminded him of funerals he'd attended as a boy, the kind where the dead felt more present than the living. Inside, the Emperor stood, shaking as the invisible steps approached the bed. And in that approach he felt the palace changing its allegiance corridors, remembering, rooms awakening, emptiness becoming a sovereign, until finally he understood what the tomb had been trying to teach him from the start. You can kill a person You can bury a body, but you cannot bury their absence when it has learned to walk. After that night, the emperor stopped calling it haunting, because haunting implies a ghost attached to a place, a spirit bound by bitterness and unfinished rites. And what moved through his palace was something far worse, something not bound at all, something that behaved like law, like ritual, like inevitability. He issued decrees the way drowning men clawed rope. No one was to speak the dead empress's name. No one was to enter her sealed chambers. No one was to burn flowers within the palace walls. All perfumes banned. All incense replaced with bitter medicinal smoke, as if harshness could disinfect memory. He ordered Taoist masters and court monks, summoned old men with hollow eyes and hands stained by years of ash, who arrived carrying bells, talismans, peachwood swords, and bowls of salt, and they stepped into the imperial halls with grim confidence, as if they had negotiated with darkness before. Yet the moment they inhaled the air near the sealed chamber, their confidence tightened into fear, because the fragrance there was not just scent, but presence, dense, wet, alive, and it clung to their nostrils like a hand. "It isn't a restless soul," one master whispered, voice shaking despite himself. "It's an absence that has become a guest." The emperor snapped at them to fix it anyway, so they began their rites at midnight, when the palace held its breath the way a guilty house holds its breath before a knock. They placed salt lines at thresholds, hung talismans at doorframes, burned paper charms until smoke filled corridors and gray ribbons, and rang bells whose sharp metallic cries were meant to scatter spirits like birds. But the corridors answered the bells with silence so thick it felt intentional, and when the first talisman was pinned to the sealed chamber's door, it did not burn or fall, it simply dampened, curling at the edges as if soaked in cold dew, the ink running like tears until the characters blurred into meaningless stains. The emperor watched from behind a screen, jaw clenched, because meaninglessness was the one thing he could not tolerate. He had built an empire on the idea that symbols obey. The masters advanced anyway, and with chanting that grew louder and louder, they forced the sealed door open, and the room beyond greeted them not with darkness, but with moonlight and perfume, that same suffocating bloom of night flowers, as if someone had just stepped out a moment ago. In the center of the chamber, on the lacquered floor, a trail of wet footprints waited. Fresh, damp, small, leading in a neat loop around the bed, around the dressing table, around the mirror, repeating the same route like a ritual circle. And where the footprints ended, there was nothing, not even a smudge, as though the walker had lifted away into air. One monk's knees buckled at the sight because he recognized the pattern as a returning circuit, the kind drawn in funeral rites to guide a spirit back to rest. Except here the circuit didn't guide away. It circled inward, tightening like a knot. The emperor's skin crawled. "Seal it," he ordered, and the masters tried. They hammered nails of blessed wood into the threshold, placed iron locks across the door, wrapped the handles with red thread and wax seals, and drew a large talisman circle on the floor with cinnabar, a prison made of symbols. Then, trembling, they stepped back and waited for the palace to quiet, for proof that nothing could cross. But as the hour deepened, the fragrance grew stronger instead of fading, and within it rose the soft tap, 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 again calm, measured, coming not from inside the sealed chamber, but from the corridor outside it, as though the absence had no interest in being trapped because it was never truly in the room to begin with. The master nearest the door raised his bell and rang it sharply, and in response the corridor chilled, lantern flames shrinking, and the talisman circle on the floor darkened as if dampness were seeping through paint. The footsteps approached the sealed door and stopped, and for one breath the palace became so quiet the emperor heard his own heart stutter. And then, without haste, the sound moved again, passing straight through the sealed threshold as if locks and thread were mist. And inside the chamber, new wet footprints appeared over the cinnabar circle, pressing it into smeared red paste like blood diluted by tomb water. The monks recoiled, eyes wide, and one of them began to chant louder with panic in his voice. But the chant faltered because the perfume thickened suddenly into something oppressive, pushing air out of lungs, forcing mouths to breathe shallow. The emperor's face went gray. He wasn't watching a spirit break rules. He was watching rules fail entirely. The absence was not stepping over barriers. It was demonstrating that barriers were meaningless to what had no body. Enraged, the Emperor ordered the most violent solution left to him. Remove the shoes from the palace. Remove the source. So, at dawn, he marched to the treasury, where the 3 sealed boxes were stored behind guards, demanded the locks broken, and when the lids were pried open, the officials flinched at the fragrance bursting out like trapped breath. But inside the innermost box, the embroidered shoes sat perfectly arranged, clean, delicate, toe-to-toe, exactly as if they had never moved. The Emperor stared, mind cracking under contradiction. The palace heard them walk each night, yet here they were, motionless. He lifted one shoe with trembling hands and felt warmth in the silk again. That living warmth that mocked logic. And in the embroidery he noticed a tiny dark stain at the heel, fresh, wet as if the shoe had stepped through tomb moisture and returned politely to its box afterward. It wasn't the shoes leaving the box like an object leaves a room. It was the idea of the shoes traveling the palace. A ritual made mobile, a route repeating itself regardless of storage. Still refusing surrender, the Emperor ordered the shoes destroyed, and destruction, to a tyrant, always felt like control. A brazier was brought, coals fed until flames rose bright and hungry, and the shoes were lowered toward it with iron tongs as though handling venom. The silk caught fire quickly, too quickly, flames licking up golden thread, and the scent that erupted was suffocating beyond anything before, a blooming sweetness so dense that men coughed until they gagged, eyes streaming, and in the smoke the Emperor thought he saw a figure briefly. Pale sleeves, lowered gaze, standing calmly beside the fire as if watching her own funeral repeat. The officials screamed and stumbled back. The shoes blackened, curled, collapsed into ash, and then, the moment they fully burned, the palace went silent in the deepest way, like a held breath, and from far down the corridor came the sound. Tap, 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 unchanged, patient, perfectly measured, approaching the Emperor's chamber as if nothing had been burned at all. The Emperor's hand shook violently, because now the horror revealed its true nature. The shoes were never the anchor. The coffin's emptiness was. It wasn't a body returning. It was a missing place, demanding recognition. The role of Empress, walking its nightly circuit because the palace had tried to erase it without closure. That night, even with ashes scattered into the river and the brazier scrubbed clean, the footsteps returned earlier than ever. Not timid now, but confident, echoing across multiple corridors at once, as if the absence had learned to split itself, to occupy the palace like perfume occupies air. Impossible to catch, impossible to corner. Servants began finding wet footprints outside their own doors, small and neat, as if the invisible walker had paused to listen. And in some rooms, the scent bloomed, so thick women woke weeping without knowing why, hands pressed to throats, as if remembering a strangled apology. The Emperor grew paranoid, posting guards at every junction. Yet guards reported the same humiliating detail. The footsteps did not avoid them. Tap, tap. They passed directly between men, like silk slipping through fingers, leaving damp prints that formed around boots as if politely navigating a crowded court. Once, in the early hours when the Emperor sat rigid with sleepless eyes, the footsteps stopped outside his chamber and did not enter. Instead, they stood there for a long time, and in that long pause the Emperor felt the full crushing weight of being watched by something that had no eyes, judged by something that needed no voice. And then, very softly, the latch clicked, not opening, just clicking, as if testing his fear, and the Emperor realized with cold clarity that the absence was not trying to kill him quickly. It was letting him live inside a palace where nothing could ever feel empty again, because emptiness had finally learned how to walk. The Emperor began to fear quiet the way other men fear knives, because quiet was the only thing that made the footsteps sharp enough to feel like they were inside his ribs. And by the time the 5th night arrived after the burning, he no longer sat like a ruler. He sat like a prisoner, awaiting a scheduled visit, eyes raw from sleeplessness, hands trembling around a cup of bitter tea that had gone cold hours ago, his chamber filled with harsh medicinal incense that could not fully smother the floral scent leaking back in anyway. as if the palace had learned to produce her perfume on its own. Outside his door stood twice the usual number of guards, and the corridor was lined with lanterns, bright enough to make shadows thin and nervous. Yet none of that made him feel safer, because safety depends on edges, doors, locks, distance, and what had entered his palace had no respect for edges at all. At midnight exactly, so precisely it felt like an appointment. The air changed, not with wind, but with a subtle pressure drop, like the palace exhaling, and the footsteps began far away in the outer hall. Tap, 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 slow, formal, measured to the rhythm of court protocol, approaching as if the invisible wearer had studied etiquette even in death. The guards straightened, spears lifted, jaws clenched, and the captain barked a command to halt whoever was coming, but his voice sounded muffled the moment it left his mouth, like the corridor had swallowed it, and the steps continued without pause. Tap, tap, drawing closer, each footfall leaving no visible print on the corridor stones because the stones were too rough. But the air itself carried the damp chill of tomb water and that suffocating blossom-heavy perfume, thickening as the presence neared. The lantern flames began to lean toward the footsteps, as if attracted, then shrank, then flared pale gold, and the guards' faces whitened, because they were witnessing the same humiliation again. Their bodies were real, their weapons real, their fear real, yet the thing approaching treated them like furniture. When the footsteps reached the Emperor's door, they paused, and that pause stretched long enough to feel deliberate, theatrical, like a courtier waiting to be acknowledged. And inside the chamber, the Emperor's heartbeat slammed so hard he thought it might betray him by making sound. He rose from his chair with stiff dignity and forced his voice into command. "Enter," he said, because if he was going to be destroyed, he would at least wear the mask of authority to the end. The latch clicked. The door opened inward, not violently, not forced, simply opening with the calm ease of someone returning to her own chamber, and the guards outside staggered back because cold perfume poured through the crack like breath. Yet no figure appeared in the doorway. Only the sound crossed the threshold. Tap, tap. Now inside the Emperor's room, moving across his polished floorboards with impossible clarity. And with each step, the chill spread outward in a thin wave, frosting the edge of the brazier, making the tea in his cup tremble as if startled. Wet footprints began to bloom on the lacquered floor again, dark, neat, angled with feminine poise, and they moved straight toward him in a perfect line, the route of a private audience, while the Emperor stood frozen, unable to decide whether to fall to his knees in regret or to run like a child. The footprints stopped a few inches from his bare feet, so close he could see the delicate curve of toes and the damp imprint, and the scent surged until breathing felt like swallowing flowers packed into the throat. In that suffocating bloom, the Emperor felt the worst part. Not fear of pain, but fear of presence without face. The feeling of being judged by something you cannot look in the eyes. He whispered her name then. Finally, because the palace had already been saying it for him in the rhythm of footsteps. And the moment he did, the air in front of him tightened as if a body had leaned closer, and the lantern light flickered, throwing a shadow on the wall that did not match any man in the room. The faint outline of a woman's sleeves and bowed head, but with no feet beneath the hem, only darkness where legs should be, as though she were nothing but courtly shape stitched from perfume. The Emperor's mouth trembled. "I was deceived," he said, voice cracking with a sincerity that felt too late to matter. "I didn't know. I believed them. And here his pride died completely, collapsing into simple human desperation. "I missed you." The chamber went very still, and then something answered, not in words spoken aloud, but in a sound so quiet it felt like the room remembering rather than a voice speaking. The soft creak of silk settling, the whisper of fabric lowering, and in the wet footprints on the floor. The spacing changed as if the unseen wearer had knelt. The Emperor's breath hitched because he recognized the gesture intimately. She always knelt before him the same way, graceful, composed, even when her heart was bruised. And then the scent shifted, thinning slightly, not as mercy, but as focus. And in that thinning, the Emperor heard something else inside the silence. A faint, steady breathing that wasn't his, slow as tomb air, patient as stone, and his skin crawled because the breathing came from the emptiness itself. He tried to step forward, compelled by longing so strong it was almost religious. But the instant his foot moved, the footprints rose, stepping back, keeping that exact distance. The distance of a court that never allows the sovereign true intimacy. And the emperor suddenly understood the deepest cruelty of all. She was not returning to embrace him, she was returning to hold court, to restore the balance that he had broken, to occupy the role that had been taken from her, and to make him, for once, the one who waited outside a door. The footsteps began again. Tap, tap, circling him slowly, and as they circled, the lanterns around the room began to dim one by one. Not going out, but lowering as if the palace were drawing curtains for a final ceremony, until the chamber felt less like a bedroom and more like a tomb with silk walls, and the emperor realized the palace itself had shifted allegiance. It was now her palace, her route, her ritual. Panic flared and he shouted for guards, but the sound came out wrong, thin, distant because the corridor outside had gone silent too, and through the open door he saw the guards standing stiff as statues with blank faces, eyes wide, mouths open as if trying to call out yet unable to make sound, as though the absence had stolen not their bodies but their permission to speak. The footprints stopped behind the emperor, and a cold pressure settled on the back of his neck like fingers resting lightly, intimate and inevitable. And he felt the most humiliating thing a ruler can feel, being handled without force, being moved not by violence but by inevitability. His knees weakened, and he sank to the floor involuntarily, robe pooling around him, posture turning into a bow he had never given anyone, and as his forehead lowered toward the lacquered wood, he saw the wet footprints before his eyes shift position until they were directly in front of him, perfectly aligned as if he were kneeling before an unseen sovereign. And then finally the judgment came, soft as perfume, cold as tombstone, delivered not as revenge, but as a simple statement of fact that cut deeper than hatred. You opened the coffin, the absence seemed to say, not with sound, but with the palace itself shaping the meaning in the air, and you found what you deserved. At those words, the emperor's chest seized violently, not as if stabbed, but as if his lungs had forgotten how to take air that wasn't hers, and he clawed at his throat as the floral scent surged into him, filling him, crowding him, turning each breath into drowning in blossoms. He tried to crawl backward, but the floor beneath his hands grew slick with cold dampness, and when he looked down he saw his palms leaving wet marks, as if the tomb's moisture was rising up through his skin, as if he was becoming part of the root. The lantern light blurred, and in that blur he saw the open door at the foot of his chamber, the threshold to the corridor, and beyond it, for a heartbeat, the cemetery tunnel of the tomb, black and descending, as if the palace had folded itself open to reveal its own grave. The emperor's final breath came out as a flower-sweet cough, and when his body went still, the wet footprints turned and walked away, tap, tap, leaving his chamber without hurry, because the visit had not been about killing. It had been about restoring balance, closing the loop. The guards outside suddenly gasped, as if released from underwater, collapsing with sobs, voices returning in ragged bursts, and they rushed into the chamber to find the emperor dead on the floor, with his face turned toward the doorway like a man who died listening. There was no wound on him, no poison foam, no sign of struggle besides the claw marks on his own throat and the dampness on the wood beneath his hands. And the strangest detail of all was the scent. The room smelled of fresh blossoms, as if it had just been prepared for a bride. And on the floor, circling the emperor's body once, was a perfect ring of wet footprints. Small, neat, precise, like a final ritual circuit completed. The ministers tried to erase it, scrubbing until the lacquer shone raw. Yet the next night, and the night after that, palace servants still heard the footsteps sometimes tap, tap, not always approaching a bed now, but pacing corridors, as if inspecting, as if ruling, and whenever the steps passed, lantern flames leaned in reverence, and the air filled with perfume thick enough to make men lower their eyes. Years later, long after a new emperor took the throne, and new laws were carved into stone, Old guards still whispered the same private truth. The wronged empress was never found in her coffin, because she had not returned as a ghost. She returned as a vacancy that refused to stay empty, as the perfect sound of shoes walking where she should have been, reminding every ruler after that. The most terrifying thing in the world isn't what comes back from the dead. It's what was never truly buried in the first place. The mirror of guilt. The general's bedchamber was built to glorify victory, yet tonight it felt like a mausoleum dressed in silk, heavy curtains swallowing moonlight, bronze braziers breathing low red heat, and the air thick with a bitter medicinal incense, meant to drown the stink of battlefield blood that still clung to his armor seams no matter how many times servants scrubbed. Outside, the fortress celebrated drums, laughter, wine cups, striking wood sounds of men who believed the war had ended because their commander had returned alive. But inside this chamber, the general sat alone, stripped of his helmet and glory, staring at the faint sheen of his sword laid across a lacquered table, as if the blade might answer questions no human would dare speak. His name was carved into songs now, his triumph announced on banners, his face painted onto the imagination of soldiers who needed a hero to keep them from shaking at night. Yet the truth of victory lived closer to the skin, the stink of burnt hair, the crunch of ribs beneath boots, the wet sound of a throat opening when steel insists. The general had carried that truth home inside his chest like a stone, and he had tried to bury it under ceremony, under medals, under wine. But one stubborn detail refused burial: the witch he killed at the edge of the conquered village. The woman whose hut had stood alone near the marsh as if the land itself wanted distance from her. She was not the kind of witch the court liked to whisper about. No dramatic cackling, no obvious monstrousness. She had been old and calm and unpleasantly composed, the kind of person whose eyes make you feel counted. And when the general's soldiers dragged her out, she did not beg. She only looked at him as if he were a child playing emperor, and that look had irritated him more than any curse. The villagers claimed she could call sickness from puddles, could pull names out of smoke, could make a man dream of his own funeral until he stopped eating. And the general, high from conquest, drunk on obedience, decided superstition was merely another province to conquer. He demanded she kneel. She did, slow and steady, and her hair fell forward like pale thread. "You think your blade makes you clean," she said softly. In the softness of her voice, no fear in it, made his soldiers shift uneasily. The general smiled with that cruel, bright confidence men wear when they need to prove they are not afraid. "I think your mouth makes you dangerous," he replied, and he ordered her tongue cut out, not because it was necessary, but because it felt like control. The witch didn't scream when they did it, only released a wet breath, and looked up at him with eyes so clear they made his stomach tighten. And then, blood dripping down her chin, she smiled, just slightly, as if she had learned something amusing about him. The general killed her himself after that. One swift downward thrust through the chest, steel sliding in with the smooth inevitability of practice, and as she collapsed into mud, she lifted one hand and pressed two fingers against his boot, smearing a small dark streak across the leather like ink marking paper. That touch was nothing. It should have meant nothing. Yet all the way back to the fortress, even as his men cheered, the general kept glancing down at his boot, at that faint stain, feeling a cold itch in his mind, as though something had tagged him. Now, hours later, in the privacy of his chamber, he finally allowed himself to relax his shoulders, to let the night swallow the public face of command. And when he reached for a cup of water beside the bed, the surface of the water caught the brazier's glow and turned into a dark mirror. The general's hand paused midair, because in that reflection, he saw his own face, hard, proud, shadowed by firelight, and behind his shoulder, clear as if lit by another flame, the witch's face. She was standing close enough that her breath should have warmed his neck, her mouth still smiling even though he had cut her tongue out, her eyes fixed on him with the patient amusement of someone waiting for a slow lesson to complete. The general jerked the cup away and the water rippled, breaking the image into trembling fragments. Yet when the surface calmed again, her face returned, steadier, as if ripples were only a curtain she could wait behind. His heartbeat slammed. He forced himself to look over his shoulder. Nothing, only shadow and curtain and silent stone. He looked back down. There she was again, smiling in the water like she belonged there. The general's throat tightened with a sudden, humiliating fear, because he knew the difference between enemy and imagination, and this felt like neither. It felt like the world had learned how to accuse him. He snatched the cup and hurled it across the room, water exploding against the wall, clay shattering, and the fortress celebration outside swallowed the noise without noticing. But inside the chamber, the air went colder, and the brazier flame leaned briefly as if startled. The general stood breathing hard, telling himself it was fatigue, it was incense, it was the nervous aftertaste of battle. Yet when he stepped toward the lacquered table where his sword lay, the polished steel caught the brazier light in a thin, bright line. And in that line he saw it again, his own face, and behind him, the witch. Closer now, her smile deeper, her head tilted as if admiring her work. The general's hand trembled as he lifted the blade. He angled it away, then toward himself, trying to catch a different reflection angle. But no matter how he moved, the witch stayed in the same position, always behind him, always exactly where he could not see by turning around, always occupying the unguarded space at his back. The blind spot every soldier fears. Sweat broke on his temples. He barked for servants to enter, needing living bodies to disrupt whatever curse this was. But when they arrived, two young men smelling of wine and fear, he held the sword up and demanded, "Tell me what you see." The servants blinked, confused, and one dared glance at the blade and immediately paled. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again as if his tongue couldn't decide whether to speak. "My lord," he whispered finally, voice shaking. "There is a woman." The other servant refused to look and dropped to his knees, palms pressed to the floor, muttering prayers. The general's stomach dropped, because this was no solitary madness. It was shared sight. He dismissed them with a sharp motion, fury rising like heat because humiliation is the quickest way to turn fear into violence. And once alone, he paced the chamber, avoiding reflective surfaces, like they were open wounds. The bronze basin, the lacquered furniture, the polished armor hung on the wall. Yet every time he accidentally crossed a line of light, he glimpsed her somewhere inside the curved brass of the brazier, within the glossy glaze of a ceramic jar, in the faint shine of his own ring, always smiling, always behind him, as if the world itself had become a network of eyes designed to show him the same truth he refused to acknowledge. He covered mirrors with cloth, overturned basins, ordered every polished object removed from his room, but even dull metal held enough shine for accusation, and by dawn he was exhausted and furious, a man losing territory not on maps but in his mind. Still, the general did not die easily. He had survived ambushes, arrows, sickness. He believed he could outlast a curse through force of will. He ordered a large mirror, brought an ornate war trophy taken from the enemy governor's estate, tall as a man, framed in carved wood because he decided he would confront the curse directly, look at it without blinking, until it broke. The mirror was placed opposite his bed, and the moment the cloth was pulled away, the chamber seemed to deepen, as if the mirror opened a second room inside itself. The general stood before it, candle in hand, staring into his own reflection, like a man meeting his rival. And there she was, instantly behind him, smiling wider than ever, her hair hanging in wet pale ropes, her eyes bright, with the calm certainty of something that had already won. The general's jaw tightened. "You are dead," he said to the mirror, voice low and dangerous. "I killed you." The witch's smile did not change. It simply held. That was the true horror. She did not threaten him, did not rage, did not plead. She only smiled as if the real killing had not begun yet, as if death was merely the first step in a longer possession. And as the candlelight flickered over the mirror's surface, the general noticed something new, faint dark lines on his own face in the reflection, hair-thin cracks spreading from an old scar along his cheek, scars he had earned in youth now opening slowly as if pulled apart from the inside, bleeding not bright red but dark, sticky. Then the pain arrived a moment later, to a deep dull ache in the scar tissue like a wound remembering how to be fresh. The general's eyes widened. He lifted a finger to his cheek and felt warm wetness. Behind him in the mirror, the witch smiled as if savoring a private joke. The general understood then. The curse was not only sight, it was reopening, making the past bleed again, turning old victories into fresh injuries. And as he stood shaking before the mirror, watching thin lines of blood creep down his reflection's face, he finally felt what no enemy had ever managed to give him: true paranoia. The knowledge that the most dangerous thing in the room was not a blade in front of him, but the smiling absence behind his shoulder. By the second night, the general had learned the most humiliating truth a soldier can learn. You can guard a door. You can command a wall of shields. You can predict an ambush in fog, but you cannot guard your own eyes from what they are forced to see. And the fortress that had once felt like a sanctuary after battle now felt like a cage made of polished things. He tried to control it, like he controlled everything through orders. So he commanded that all mirrors within his quarters be removed, and all bronze basins flipped upside down, that cups be replaced with rough clay, that armor be hung under cloth, that servants wear dull fabric without pins, even that blades be kept sheathed so no edge could catch firelight. And for a few hours the chamber seemed calmer, its air thick with bitter incense and fatigue. The world narrowed into soft shadows where nothing could reflect. Yet reflection does not require a mirror. It requires only a surface willing to confess. And the first time he leaned over a bowl of dark tea, he saw her again, not in the liquid's gleam but in the thin skin of steam hovering above it, her face forming in the shifting vapor, as if smoke itself had learned the shape of her smile. He jerked back, knocking the bowl, tea spilling in a slow black puddle that crept across the floorboards, and in that puddle her face appeared immediately, clear as if painted. Those calm eyes, that bloodless smile, always positioned behind him as if the universe had decided his back should never be safe again. The general tried to turn, to catch her in the room, but turning only showed him curtains and stone and his own heartbeat pounding against silence. And when he faced the puddle again, the face was still there, patient, as though waiting for him to stop pretending he could escape the angle of accusation. He ordered the puddle scrubbed, the floor dried, but an hour later he saw her in the faint oily sheen of the brazier's smoke on the metal rim, then in the polished black lacquer of a tray, then in the tiny reflected glow inside a servant's wet eyes when they bowed too close. That last one shook him worse than the puddles, because it meant she wasn't trapped in objects. She was using any small brightness, any tear film, any glint of moisture as a window. He began to suspect the entire world was turning into a mirror specifically for him, a network of surfaces hungry to show him what he had done, and suspicion, when fed long enough, becomes certainty. He stopped eating in public because soup's surface held too much shine, stopped drinking wine because the dark red liquid looked too much like the blood in her mouthless smile, stopped sleeping because sleep forced him to close his eyes, and when he closed them he saw her even more vividly, standing behind the lids as if inside his skull. In the rare moments he did drift off, his dreams returned him to the conquered marsh village, the witch kneeling in mud, tongue already severed, smiling at him with a serenity that made his hands shake, and every time his dream self plunged the sword into her chest, the blade met resistance like thick fabric, and the next moment he would wake with a gasp to find his old wounds, burning wounds he hadn't thought about in years. An arrow scar on his thigh splitting open into a thin, wet line, a slash across his ribs, throbbing until he could taste iron, a puncture under his collarbone blooming with dark bruising as if the body was remembering pain it had archived. He went to the physician at dawn and demanded answers, and the old physician, pale and careful, examined him and said the scars were reopening in patterns, too neat to be accidental, like stitching, unraveling. It's the cold. The physician tried to lie, because court survival depends on lying in ways that sound reasonable, but when he dabbed the wound with cloth, the cloth came away, not bright with fresh blood, but dark and sticky, with a scent faintly floral, like crushed petals mixed into iron. The general's stomach lurched. Floral. Her perfume was inside his wounds. He dismissed the physician and paced, rage building like fever. Because rage is how men like him protect themselves from the shame of fear. He decided the mirror in his chamber, the tall trophy mirror he had demanded, was the source, the anchor of the curse, the main eye through which he watched him. so he ordered it dragged into the courtyard at midday where sunlight could expose trickery and witnesses could prove bravery, and he gathered his captains and dozens of soldiers, forcing them to attend, as though turning this into a public execution would restore his authority. The mirror stood upright in the courtyard like a silent rival, catching the pale winter sun, reflecting soldiers and stiff lines and banners fluttering above. And in the mirror's center, the general saw himself approach, armor clinking softly, face hard with public confidence. He stopped a step away, and there she was behind him, of course, smiling brighter in daylight as if night had never mattered, the edges of her hair shimmering slightly like damp thread. Her eyes fixed on him with that same calm amusement, and the general felt his pride twist into hatred so sharp it nearly steadied him. He drew his sword slowly, letting the steel sing a faint whisper as it cleared the scabbard, then raised it high. "Witness," he told his men, voice booming, "how superstition dies." His captains shouted approval with forced enthusiasm. But some soldiers couldn't meet the mirror because they had seen the face too, and it had drained color from them. The general swung, blade striking the mirror dead center with a violent metallic crack, and the glass spider-webbed outward in jagged veins, splitting his reflection into fractured pieces. Yet the witch's smile did not break with it. Instead, it multiplied. Hundreds of smiles bloomed across the shattered surface, each shard holding a different angle of her face, each fragment showing her behind him, behind him, behind him, as if no matter how you divided glass, guilt remained whole. The courtyard fell silent, except for the faint tinkling of newly loose shards settling. And in that silence, the general heard something that froze his blood, a soft scraping sound inside the mirror, like nails dragging across wet stone. He lifted his sword again and struck harder, smashing the mirror further, until shards clattered onto the courtyard stones like ice breaking. And as they fell, each piece held an image not only of her face now, but of her body, separated into parts by the fractures. One shard showed her pale hand flexing. Another showed her shoulder turning. Another showed her mouthless smile widening as if delighted. And then, the worst shard fell near the general's boot and reflected upward at him, showing not her behind him but her crawling, elbows sliding, fingers pulling, as though she were pressing against the underside of the glass trying to find a seam. The general's throat tightened. He stepped back, but the shards on the ground shimmered, catching sunlight, and in each shimmer the witch moved small movements at first, as if testing limits, hands pressing, hair shifting, eyes blinking slowly with patience. One soldier screamed and fled. Another dropped his spear and fell to his knees, vomiting. The general's captains tried to hold formation, but their faces betrayed them with wide, terrified eyes, because no tactic exists for something that can inhabit fragments. The general snarled and ordered the shards swept up and destroyed. So servants rushed with brooms, but the moment broom bristles touched glass, the servant yelped and fell back because the broom handle darkened, as if soaked, and on the wood appeared the faint imprint of 2 fingers. The same 2-finger mark the witch had left on the general's boot at death pressing, as though she had grabbed through the shard and left a signature. The general's pulse roared in his ears. "Burn them," he barked. Fire always obeyed him. Fire was the simple language of conquest, so braziers were brought and mirror shards were shoveled into them. Yet as the first shards heated, the courtyard filled with that suffocating floral stench, so rich it made men gag, and from within the braziers came the softest wet laughing sound. Not loud, not theatrical, but intimate, as if she was amused by his desperation. The general watched the shards glow and crack, but in the heat the reflections didn't vanish, they warped, stretching her features into grotesque angles while still smiling, still watching him. And as the braziers roared, the general felt a sudden sharp pain in his rib scar, so intense his knees nearly buckled. He clutched his side and felt warm wetness, and when he looked down, his fingers were stained dark with blood that smelled faintly of blossoms. He looked up, and on a shard still unburned at the edge of the fire, he saw his own reflection clutching his ribs, and behind him, the witch leaned close and placed her palm lightly on his scar, as if pulling it open. The general staggered back, face draining of color, because now the curse had moved beyond sight into touch, beyond reflection into flesh, and he realized with a cold sinking certainty that every mirror shard was a doorway, every reflective sliver a mouth through which she could reach, and no matter how many times he smashed the glass, he was only creating more entrances. That night, as he lay in his chamber with bandaged scars throbbing and the fortress celebrations finally quieted into uneasy sleep, he saw her again. Not in any object now, but in the darkness itself, her smile floating just behind his shoulder whenever he dared close his eyes, and somewhere in the shadows of the room he heard the softest sound of glass being scraped from the inside, as if countless tiny fingers were gathering, preparing, learning how to crawl out of reflection and into the only surface left, his skin. After the courtyard burning, the general stopped trusting the word destroy, because destruction had only multiplied the witch's angles, and now every place he walked felt littered with invisible glass, even when the stones were clean. The servants scrubbed the courtyard until no sparkle remained. Yet the general still stepped as if afraid a shard might bite his heel, and that fear, small, constant, was the first true victory the dead woman had taken from him. She had turned his certainty into carefulness. He ordered the fortress polished surfaces dulled with ash, ordered bronze fittings roughened, ordered water jars kept covered, and for a day, the world obeyed in the way it always obeyed his voice. But the curse was no longer tied to objects. It had begun to recognize him as its best mirror. It started with his wounds, those old scars that had reopened like stitched mouths, because scar tissue reflects memory the way lacquer reflects flame. And at night, when the brazier burned low, he would feel the scars shimmer not with light, but with sensation, a thin crawling itch beneath healed flesh, as if something inside was turning over and looking for a seam. He tried to ignore it, gripping his dagger until his knuckles whitened, yet the itch intensified into a sting, and when he tore off his robe and leaned toward the candle to examine himself, he saw the skin around the rib scar wasn't simply split. It was glossy, wet in places, as though coated with invisible oil, and within that shine he caught a flicker of movement, not outside him but within the wound line, as if the scar had become a narrow, reflective strip. He held the candle closer, breath shallow, and in that thin, wet sheen he saw it, a tiny sliver of face, an eye, and the curve of a mouthless smile peering out from inside his scar, like someone pressed against glass from the other side. His stomach lurched violently and he staggered back, but the moment he moved, the image shifted too, tracking him, keeping that hateful position behind his shoulder no matter how he twisted. And as he watched, the scar twitched as if responding to her amusement, the flesh tightening, loosening, tightening like a lip rehearsing speech. He ripped bandages off and poured hot wine onto the wound to sterilize it, the liquid burning, his teeth bared in pain, yet the pain only coaxed it wider. And for one horrific heartbeat, he felt a light pressure under the skin fingertips, delicate and cold, pressing outward, testing the boundary of his body the way a prisoner tests bars. He screamed, more in rage than terror, and called for the physician again. But when the physician entered and saw the general shirtless, candlelight trembling across blood and reopened scars, the old man's face drained of color as if he had seen a battlefield wound that shouldn't exist. "Look," the general snarled, grabbing the physician's wrist and forcing him closer. Forcing another witness because he needed proof he wasn't losing his mind. And the physician leaned in, trembling, and then gave a thin, strangled sound and recoiled so hard he nearly fell, whispering, "There is glass." Because within the scar line, tiny, translucent flecks had appeared, embedded under flesh like splinters of mirror, catching candlelight in micro-glints that didn't belong to bone or blood. The general froze, because he remembered the courtyard shards. He remembered how the witch moved behind them, and now he understood. He hadn't burned every fragment. Or worse, he had burned them into smoke and breathed them in. Or worse than that, the curse had used the act of shattering as permission to plant itself wherever reflection could survive. And what surface reflected more intimately than skin stretched over guilt? He ordered the physician to cut the flecks out, to carve them away, no matter how deep. And the physician, sobbing quietly, heated a blade and began to dig at the scar with trembling hands, the general biting down hard on leather to keep from roaring. And as the blade tip lifted a small, translucent sliver from the flesh, the candlelight hit it, and the physician saw clearly inside it, magnified like a jewel. The witch's eye blinking slowly, calm as sleep, and the physician screamed and dropped it. The sliver fell onto the floorboards, and instead of lying still, it tilted slightly of its own accord as if searching for angle, then caught the candlelight again, and showed behind the general, her smile widening in satisfaction. The general's blood ran cold. He stomped on the sliver, grinding it into the wood until it cracked, yet even as it broke, it split into smaller flecks that each still held a fraction of her expression. A cheek curve here, a blink there, proof that breaking did not erase her. Breaking only made her more distributed. The physician begged to stop, hands shaking, saying this was not medicine. But the general was beyond listening now, beyond reason, and he seized the heated blade himself and began to cut, dragging steel along scar tissue, gouging mirror flecks out with brutal determination. And each time he lifted a piece of shining sliver free, he saw her within it, sometimes an eye, sometimes the edge of her mouthless smile, sometimes a pale hand curled as if gripping a ledge until his stomach churned with the certainty that she was not merely watching him anymore. She was using him as terrain. The pain became unbearable, and still he continued, because soldiers are trained to believe pain is temporary while defeat is eternal. But then something changed. The mirror flecks in his flesh began to line up, as if responding to one another, as if forming a larger reflective surface under the skin, and the general felt the itching shift into a coordinated pull, like hundreds of tiny threads tugging in the same direction. His scar gaped wider than it should, and from within he heard its soft scraping, the same sound he'd heard in the shattered mirror, only now it came from inside his ribs, inside the quiet darkness of his body. His breath hitched, eyes wide, and the candle flame flickered wildly as if the room itself was startled. And then, in the glossy wet interior of his open wound, the witch's face appeared fully for the first time. Not behind him, not in a bowl, not in steel, but inside his flesh, smiling up at him from a cavity that should have held only blood and muscle, her expression calm, amused, intimate, as though she had finally found the perfect mirror, a man who could not look away. The general staggered back, clutching his side, and as he moved, he felt something slide beneath his skin, a slow repositioning, like a creature crawling under cloth, and in the candlelight, he saw the skin on his shoulder ripple faintly, then settle, then ripple again, as if a hand had dragged across the underside. He backed away from every reflective object in the room on instinct, but it didn't matter now, because reflection had relocated into him. The fortress grew quieter over the following days, not because celebrations ended, but because servants began to fear being near their commander. Fear of his eyes darting to every glint, fear of him suddenly shouting at a kettle lid, fear of his fingers clawing at scars until blood-soaked bandages. He began to cover himself in rough cloth, wrapping arms and torso so no sheen could show, and he kept his room dark, refusing lamps, refusing candles, living in shadow like prey. Yet in that darkness, the witch's smile became even brighter in his mind, and the old wounds continued to crack open with each heartbeat as if the body itself was confessing. The general finally decided to flee the fortress, to ride out into open land where moonlight could not bounce so tightly off walls and lacquer, and he set out before dawn with only a small escort. But as their horses crossed a river ford, he looked down for one careless moment at the black water sliding past, and in the moving surface he saw not only the witch behind him, but beside him, her pale sleeves drifting as if she sat on the horse with him, and he felt a cold pressure settle at his back like a passenger leaning close. His horse screamed and reared, throwing him into the mud, and as he hit the ground, he saw his face reflected in dozens of tiny wet droplets on the grass, each droplet holding her smile, surrounding him like a court of witnesses. And in that ring of shining moisture, he understood with collapsing dread that she didn't need mirrors anymore, because guilt itself was reflective, and it would keep offering her surfaces until the last surface left was his own eyes. He returned to the fortress at dusk, with mud drying on his boots like shame, escort shaken, horse foam flecked, and the general's face no longer held the proud, sharp certainty men followed into battle. It held the hunted tightness of a man whose enemy had crawled inside his armor. He tried to hide it, because commanders cannot afford weakness, Yet weakness had become visible in him in small betrayals. The way his eyes avoided polished spearheads, the way he flinched at water bowls, the way his fingers kept drifting to old scars as if checking whether they were still his. He ordered his chamber stripped again, not only of reflective objects, but of anything that could hold a thin shine. Oil lamps replaced with smoky tallow, lacquered furniture covered in rough cloth, bronze replaced with wood until the room looked less like a general's quarters and more like a monk's cell. And still it did not help, because the curse had advanced beyond environment into physiology. The witch had stopped using mirrors as an external stage and begun to use pain as her language. And pain, unlike glass, cannot be removed from a man without removing the man. That night, in the suffocating dark, he felt his old arrow scar on the thigh tighten like a knot being pulled, then warm, then split, with the soft, wet sensation of skin parting as neatly as seam thread giving way, and he sucked in a sharp breath, hand flying down to clamp it. But the blood that seeped out was not bright. It was dark and glossy, and in its wet sheen he glimpsed her again. Her smile curved in the liquid like a face emerging from ink. He stumbled to his feet, staggering, and the motion sent a flash of pain through his ribs where he had carved at himself in the last desperate attempt to dig her out. And with that pain came the scraping sound again, soft, internal, intimate, like fingernails dragging behind flesh. He could almost locate it now, not with sight, but with sensation. Something positioned just beneath his sternum, shifting whenever he breathed too deeply, as if it disliked being disturbed. The general's breath became shallow, controlled, because soldiers learn to manage breath under pressure. Yet managing breath is useless when the enemy is using your breath as rhythm. His scar line along the ribs began to glisten again, not from sweat, but from a thin wetness bleeding out of healed tissue. And within that wetness, the embedded mirror flecks caught whatever minimal light existed and flashed tiny cold glints, like eyes blinking. He clutched his side and backed into the wall, and in that moment, he realized the most humiliating point of warfare. He could not choose terrain anymore. His body was the battlefield. He shouted for the physician and demanded every wound be stitched tight, sealed with herbs, wrapped with hot compresses. But when the physician arrived, trembling, he refused to come close, because the last time he had touched the general's scar, he had seen her inside it and nearly lost his mind. Still, fear of disobedience overcame fear of curses, and the old man approached with a needle and thread, hands shaking, and began to stitch the reopening rib wound while whispering prayers through clenched teeth. The needle slid in and out, thread tightening, skin tugging, then stopped abruptly because the physician's needle struck something hard beneath the flesh, a tiny resistant tick like metal against glass. The physician froze, sweat beading at his temples, and when he pulled gently, something inside the wound pulled back, resisting with deliberate calm. And the general felt it too, a tiny internal tug, as if an unseen hand had wrapped itself around the thread from the inside. The physician whispered, "There's something." And before he could finish, the thread snapped with a sharp wet pop, and the wound opened wider in sudden defiance. And from within came a sigh perfumed, cold as though the general's body had exhaled a woman's breath. The physician stumbled back and fell, sobbing, while the general stood rigid, stomach rolling, because he understood the message. Stitches were meaningless. Seals were meaningless. Barriers did not matter to what had no body, what had only claim. The general's mind, cornered, did what cornered minds do. It reached for the oldest superstition it once mocked. "Bring the exorcists," he ordered. "Bring the shamans, the temple men, anyone." By midnight, 2 Taoist priests arrived with bells and charms, their eyes wary, faces calm in the practiced way of those who have seen men become houses for things they cannot name, and they walked the general's stripped chamber in circles, sprinkling salt, ringing bells, chanting in steady tones meant to force spirits into form. The general watched with clenched jaw as if watching a siege, hoping for signs of victory, but the bells' clear metallic cries seemed dull as they rang, muffled by the room as though the sound were being swallowed, and the incense the priest burned was sharp and clean. It had only mingled with her floral scent, rather than replacing it, creating an even more nauseating blend of purity and perfume strangling each other. The priest studied the general's wounds and saw the tiny mirror flecks embedded beneath skin, and one priest's expression tightened, slightly rare for such men because he recognized reflection as a doorway. He placed a talisman on the general's chest directly over the sternum and pressed hard, and for one heartbeat the general felt relief, as if something inside him recoiled from the holy pressure. Then instantly pain surged as if the thing had bitten back. The talisman darkened at the edges, dampened, and a thin line of floral-scented moisture crept across its paper, like sweat from a dead hand. The priest drew back sharply and murmured, "This is not a wandering soul." The general's voice turned ragged. "Then, what is it?" The priest hesitated, and that hesitation told the truth before words did. "It is a consequence," he said finally. "A reflection that has grown teeth." The general snarled in rage, because consequence is what rulers inflict, not what they endure, and he demanded they banish it anyway. The priests began a harsher rite, ringing bells faster, chanting louder, clapping wood blocks to summon attention from whatever unseen bureaucracy of spirits governed such things, and as they did, the candle flames in the chamber leaned violently toward the general's body like iron filings toward a magnet. His scars burned. The mirror flecks under skin began to brighten, shimmering faintly through flesh as if lit from within, and the general felt the internal pulling become coordinated again, hundreds of tiny tugs aligning, turning his rib cage into a tightening frame, as though something inside was assembling itself piece by piece using the shards as joints. The priest's chanting reached a peak, and one priest stabbed a peachwood sword toward the general's chest, not to harm him, but to threaten the entity within. And at that moment the general's sternum scar, an old healed bruise from a spear glance, split open like lips, and from the opening came a slick dark fluid that smelled of blossoms. And in the wetness the witch's eye appeared calm, blinking slowly, then her smile, then the curve of her cheek, forming as if his wound were a mirror being wiped clean. The priests recoiled, shock cracking their composure, and the general's knees nearly buckled, not from pain, but from the sheer wrongness of seeing a face grow out of your own flesh. The witch did not fully emerge. She didn't need to. She only leaned close enough to make her point, and in the reflection of her eye, the general saw himself as she saw him, a man swollen with pride, soaked in blood, wearing victory like perfume, and behind that pride a trembling child desperate to deny responsibility. The priests screamed their final syllables and slapped talismans onto the wound, trying to seal the mirror mouth, but the talisman slid off as if the skin had become slick glass, and the witch's smile widened in silent amusement. The general felt a sudden sharp pain in his throat, like a hidden scar opening there too, and he tasted iron and flowers, and he realized she was not trying to kill him swiftly. She was reopening him everywhere he had ever been hurt, turning his body into a mosaic of reflective wounds, each one a little mirror in which her face could appear at will. Outside the chamber, the fortress drums were quiet now. Celebrations ended, yet the general's officers heard his screams and gathered in the corridor, whispering that their commander was cursed, that the war had followed him home in a stranger form. The general staggered toward the wall and smashed his fist into it in rage, and the impact split the skin on his knuckles, blood beading dark, glossy, and in every bead he saw her, tiny and perfect, smiling up at him, and he finally understood the true shape of his doom. He had created 1,000 mirrors, with every wound he ever earned, and guilt once awakened would use them all until there was nowhere left for him to look without seeing the dead behind his shoulder. The general tried to run from himself, and it was the most pitiful campaign of his life, because a man can ride away from enemies on roads, but he cannot ride away from the angle behind his own shoulder. He sealed his chamber, dismissed priests, dismissed physicians, dismissed even captains, ordering the fortress to leave him alone as if solitude could starve the curse. Yet solitude only sharpened it the fewer voices in the room, the clearer the scraping inside his ribs became, the clearer the soft perfumed sighs that sometimes rose from his reopened scars, as if his body were learning how to breathe her breath. He began to bandage himself completely in rough linen, wrapping torso, arms, thighs until he looked like a wounded statue, and he kept the room almost entirely dark, refusing lamps, letting only a thin line of moonlight leak through the curtains like a blade, because he believed darkness would deny reflection. Yet guilt does not require light. It requires awareness, and awareness was exactly what she had weaponized. On the 7th night after the courtyard mirror was shattered, the general woke from a shallow doze to the sound of something in the room shifting softly, not a footstep, not a voice, but the delicate rustle of cloth that once would have been harmless, a servant adjusting curtains, a woman moving behind a screen except he had forbidden entry, and the door was barred, and he could smell her perfume blooming in the dark like flowers crushed underfoot. His heart slammed. He sat up too fast, and pain ripped through his rib wound, warm wetness spreading under bandages, and through the linen he felt tiny hard flecks shift like grains of glass rearranging themselves. He froze, listening, because the scraping had changed tone, less like nails now, more like a careful sawing, as if something inside him was widening a seam. The general clutched his dagger and demanded into the darkness, "Show yourself," because he could no longer endure the cowardice of unseen judgment, and in response, a faint glimmer appeared across the room, not from a lamp, not from moonlight, but from a surface that should not have been reflective at all. The big clay water jar by the wall, rough and matte, now held a thin vertical line of shine down its belly, as though the clay had been polished by invisible hands. The line widened slowly, widening the way a slit widens when an eye opens, and within that widening shimmer the general saw his own bandaged form, candleless, shadowed, and behind him, perfectly positioned, her smiling face. His stomach dropped with that familiar, helpless terror, but the terror was different now, heavier, because the witch's face in this reflection was not merely watching. It seemed closer to the surface, as if she had leaned forward until her breath fogged the glass. The general lurched up and hurled his dagger at the jar, and the blade struck with a dull thud and shattered the clay into jagged chunks that tumbled across the floor. Yet instead of ending the reflection, the shatter created it. Each broken shard of clay held a glossy patch now, slick with dark moisture, and in each patch her smile appeared in miniature, dozens of small mouths without tongues, dozens of calm eyes blinking slowly, and the general's blood turned cold because he understood the final rule of the curse. Anything broken could become a mirror. Anything fragmented could become a doorway. He backed toward the wall, panting, bandages tightening around his chest as his breath came hard, and with every inhale he felt the embedded mirror flex under his skin pull toward one another like filings toward magnet. He realized then that the witch had been patient not because she lacked power, but because she was assembling using reflections outside to prepare reflections inside, using shattered glass to seed shattered flesh. He clawed at the bandages in desperation, trying to rip them away before the thing inside could use them as pressure, and as he tore linen free, the rib wound yawned open again like a mouth, glossy and wet. And there inside the wound cavity he saw not raw muscle but shimmering plain, a reflective surface forming under the skin as if the shards had fused into a single mirror. His own terrified eyes stared back at him from within his body, and behind that inner reflection she smiled, not behind his shoulder now, but inside him, occupying the space his breath used to fill. The general staggered to the chamber's bronze basin overturned, dulled with ash, and flipped it upright in a frenzy, because part of him still believed he could negotiate with rules if he brought the right surface. And as the basin caught the thin moonlight, it became a mirror instantly, reflecting him and her, but now the image was wrong. She wasn't behind him anymore, she was in front, her pale face close to the surface, so close it looked as if her nose might press through, and her mouthless smile stretched wider with a hunger that felt less supernatural and more administrative, like a debt collector finally standing at the door. The general screamed and smashed the basin against the floor, shattering it into pieces again, creating more reflective fragments. Yet the real fracture was happening under his own ribs, because he felt a sudden internal snap, like thread breaking, and a wave of cold surged up his spine. His vision blurred, not from tears, but from a strange sheen forming across his eyes, as if his eyeballs were being lacquered from within. He stumbled to the fortress window and threw the shutters open, needing open air, needing space, needing a sky that did not reflect him back, and cold night wind slapped his face like punishment. But even the sky betrayed him. Moonlight glinted off the wet tiles on the roofline, and there she was again, smiling in every damp glimmer. Below, the courtyard puddles held her face. The river beyond the walls held her face. The world had become reflective not because it was polished, but because his guilt had learned how to project itself into everything he looked at. He turned away from the window, trembling, and in the darkness of his chamber he felt the presence finally move, no longer content to appear only in surfaces, because from his rib wound came a soft sliding sound, like wet silk being pulled through a narrow opening, and the mirror plane inside his flesh bulged outward, distorting the wound edges like rubber stretched over glass. And then, in a motion both slow and obscene, a pale hand emerged from his wound, as if pushing through water. Fingers first, slick with dark floral-scented fluid, nails clean and delicate, the hand of someone who had never held a weapon. The general's scream broke into a strangled gasp, because the hand was not ripping him apart violently, it was climbing out, using his body as a threshold. The fingers gripped the edge of the wound and pulled, and his skin stretched, pain flashing white-hot, and the general tried to slam his palm over the hand to shove it back in, but the moment his living hand touched her pale fingers, his old scars all over his body flared at once, opening like synchronized mouths, bleeding dark glossy blood that reflected candleless moonlight, and in each bleeding sheen her eyes appeared, hundreds of them, watching, smiling, as if his entire body had become a room full of mirrors. He fell to his knees, choking, because his lungs seized with the scent of flowers, and he realized too late that the curse had never been about being haunted by a dead witch. It had been about being forced to host the proof of what he did, to carry her presence the way a murderer carries memory, until memory became physical. The pale hand slid further out, followed by a sleeve of shadow that looked like wet cloth, and then her head began to form. Not fully, not like a corpse crawling out, but like an image thickening into matter, the way a face in water becomes clearer when you stop stirring. The general's vision warped, and he saw his own reflection everywhere on blood beads, on metal fragments, on wet wood, and in every one she was there, smiling, as if the whole fortress had become a single giant mirror aimed at his conscience. "Stop," he rasped, but his voice was thin and useless, and the witch's mouthless smile widened slightly, in something that could almost be pity. She did not speak. She did not need tongue or voice, because the message arrived through the oldest language, the body. His throat scar split open, suddenly, and he tasted iron and blossoms, and he understood the final brutality. She was making him die the way she died, silenced, punished, reduced to a vessel for someone else's will. The general clawed at his own eyes then, in wild instinct, because if he destroyed sight, perhaps he could destroy reflection. But his fingertips slipped on blood, and the lacquer sheen across his eyeballs thickened until the world looked glazed, reflective, and the last thing he saw before darkness swallowed detail was his own face in the basin, fragments on the floor, his eyes wide, mouth open, and behind his shoulder, her face, calm and smiling, not because she loved cruelty, but because he had finally become what he always feared, a man whose back was no longer his, a man whose body belonged to consequence. By dawn, the fortress found him dead on the chamber floor with no enemy in sight, bandages shredded, old scars opened like flowers, and scattered across the room were countless reflective fragments, bronze, clay, glass-like flecks from his own flesh, each one catching morning light, and in each one, for a heartbeat, the soldiers who dared look swore they saw a woman's eyes blinking slowly from inside the shine, as if the general had not been killed by a ghost at all, but by the simple, unbearable truth that guilt, once invited, will always find a surface to step through. The magistrate still hungers, the lover still waits by the twisted tree, and the footsteps in the hallway. They are getting closer. The East does not forget, and its spirits do not rest, they only wait for a new mind to inhabit. Perhaps, as you lie there in the stillness of your room, You'll wonder if the creak in your floorboard is just the house settling, or if an hungry ghost has finally found its way to your bedside. Thank you for wandering through the shadows with me tonight. If you can still sleep, sleep well. But remember, some dreams are just doorways, and once you've heard these tales, you've already turned the key. Good night, for now.